Tonight, we're exploring the complete hidden history of magic before Hogwarts. This is a fascinating topic, but I'll keep my narration calm to ensure you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here, and if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. When we think of the wizarding world, our minds almost instinctively drift to the Scottish Highlands, to the towering stone battlements and flickering candlelight of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. We think of it as the cradle of magical civilization, the place where it all began. But if you were to step into the drafty, shadow-filled classroom of Professor Cuthbert Binns and listen closely to the drone of a ghost who has been teaching the same lessons for centuries, you would realise a startling truth. Hogwarts is not the beginning of the story. It is actually a relatively late addition to a world that had already been vibrating with ancient power, complex politics, and deep-seated conflicts for thousands of years. Long before Godric Gryffindor, Salazar Slytherin, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Helga Hufflepuff ever shook hands and agreed to build a sanctuary for magical education. The world was a wild, unmapped frontier of sorcery. There was a time when there were no wands, no ministries, and no international laws to keep the magical and non-magical worlds apart. It was an era of raw, elemental magic, where traditions were passed down through bloodlines and secretive covens, and where the line between a god and a wizard was often blurred in the eyes of the early muggles. To understand the world that Harry Potter eventually walks into, we have to peel back the layers of dust and myth. We have to look at the foundations that were laid in the ancient world, from the early wandmakers of 382 BC to the rise of the Wizards' Council, the longest-serving form of magical government in history. Imagine a world where magic was not a secret kept behind hidden bricks in a pub wall, but a visible, terrifying, and awe-inspiring part of the human experience. In these early days, magical cultures developed in total isolation from one another. A wizard in the Nile Valley was practicing a form of magic entirely alien to a witch in the forests of Northern Europe. There was no centralized curriculum. There were no textbooks like those written by Bathilda Bagshot. Instead, there was a vast, sprawling tapestry of experimental spellcraft, some of which has been lost to time and some of which still hums beneath the surface of the modern wizarding world. The stakes of this history are higher than they might seem in a sleepy history lesson. The structures today, the Ministry of Magic, the Statute of Secrecy, even the way a wand is held, are all reactions to a chaotic and often violent prehistory. The very existence of Hogwarts was a radical response to a world that was becoming increasingly dangerous for magical children. It was a defensive measure, a fortress built to preserve knowledge that was at risk of being extinguished as the Muggle population grew and the witch hunts began to take a darker turn. But even before the four founders met, there were institutions that had stood for a millennium. Consider the Shop of Ollivander. While we know it as a dusty corner of Diagon Alley, its origins date back to nearly 4 centuries before the Common Era. This means that for over 2,000 years, the craft of wand-making was being refined, shifting the way wizards interacted with their own power. Before the wand, magic was more volatile, more difficult to channel. The invention of the wand is perhaps the most significant technological leap in magical history, yet it happened so long ago that it is treated as a given. Then there is the mystery of the ancient artifacts that predate the school itself. We hear whispers of the Deathly Hallows, the Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Invisibility Cloak. These are not just fairy tales told to children. They are relics of a medieval past that suggest a level of magical mastery that even the most brilliant modern wizards struggle to comprehend. They point to a time when individuals were pushing the boundaries of life and death long before the Ministry of Magic existed to tell them they couldn't. And what of the governance of this world? Before the Ministry, there was the Wizards' Council. This was a body that ruled for centuries, navigating the complex relationships between wizards and other magical beings, like goblins and centaurs. The history of magic is stained with the blood of the Goblin Rebellions, but conflicts that began long before the 18th century uprisings we hear about in class. These tensions over wand rights and territory are the bedrock of the magical economy and law. In this journey tonight, we are going to travel back through the mists of time. We will look at how the earliest magical societies organized themselves and how the growing pressure from the non-magical world forced a global civilization to go underground. We will explore the origins of the most beloved magical sports, like the early forms of Quidditch played on the marshes, and the brutal beginnings of the Triwizard tournament in the late 1200s. We will see how the four founders of Hogwarts didn't just build a school, but how they tried to curate and categorize a world of magic that was already ancient and overflowing with tradition. The history of magic is not a dry list of dates and names. It is the story of how a hidden society survived, how it thrived, and how it protected its most precious secrets from a world that would never understand them. It is a story of invention, from the first self-stirring cauldrons to the creation of the Daily Prophet. It is a story of the deep old magic that still lingers in the stones of Hogsmeade and the halls of the Ministry. So settle in, let the Shadowskulls grow long, and prepare to go back to the very beginning, to the time before the boy who lived, before the Dark Lord, and even before the castle on the cliff. This is the complete, hidden history of the world that magic built. There is a ghost who teaches history at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and his name is Professor Cuthbert Binns. He is, by all accounts, the most profoundly boring teacher in the entire wizarding world. His lessons are described as a monotonous drone that could put even the most energetic student into a state of suspended animation. Harry Potter himself, during his first year, found the class so dull that he could barely keep his eyes open, and the information seemed to pass through him without leaving a trace. This is the great irony of the wizarding world's educational system. The subject that should be the most thrilling, the one that should crack open the very foundations of magical reality, is taught by a man who is literally dead, and who has not changed his lesson plan in decades. But here is the secret that no one at Hogwarts seems to realise. The very dullness of Professor Binns is a kind of camouflage. The official history of magic, the one that is taught in that dusty, sun-drenched classroom, is a sanitised version of a much stranger, darker, and more ancient reality. The curriculum that Harry endures is a carefully curated list of dates, treaties, and rebellions, all presented without the blood, the terror, or the profound mystery that actually defines the magical past. And the reason for this is simple. Hogwarts itself, for all its ancient stones and shifting staircases, is a modern institution. It was founded only around the end of the 10th century, which, in the grand timeline of magic, is practically yesterday. To understand why the history is so bland, you have to understand what it is hiding. The wizarding world did not begin with the Sorting Hat or the Four Founders. It began in the deep pre-literate shadows of human prehistory, when magic was not a subject to be studied, but a force to be survived. Before there were schools, before there were ministries, before there were even wands as we know them, there was only raw, untamed power. The first witches and wizards did not learn their craft from books. They inherited it through blood, through instinct, and through dangerous bargains with forces that had no names. This was a world where magic was wild, unpredictable, and often fatal. It was a world where the line between a blessing and a curse was invisible, and where a single mispronounced word could invite something terrible into your home. And it is this world that the official curriculum ignores. The history of magic class, as taught by the ghostly Professor Binns, begins its serious study with the formation of the Wizards' Council, the first formal body of magical governance in Britain. This is presented as the dawn of civilization, the moment when order was imposed on chaos. But the Wizards' Council, which served as the longest-running form of magical government in history, was itself a reaction to something much older. It was created because the chaos of the pre-Hogwarts era had become unsustainable. The early magical communities were scattered, isolated, and deeply suspicious of one another. There were no laws, no standards, and no shared understanding of what magic should be. A witch in one valley might practice a form of herbology that was considered dark sorcery in the next valley over. A wizard in one village might use charms to heal, while another used them to enslave. This was the true age of magic before Hogwarts. It was an age of constant low-grade conflict, of blood feuds between families that lasted for centuries, and of a deep, gnawing fear of the Muggle world. Because the Muggles were not always ignorant. In those early centuries, the non-magical population knew that witches and wizards existed. They feared them, hunted them, and sometimes worshipped them. The relationship was volatile, and it shaped the development of magical society in ways that the textbooks never mention. The official history taught to Harry Potter was intentionally sanitized because the truth is too uncomfortable for a classroom. The truth is that the founders of Hogwarts did not create a school out of a noble desire for education. They created it as a fortress. They created it as a sanctuary from a world that was tearing itself apart. The four founders, Godric Gryffindor, Salazar Slytherin, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Helga Hufflepuff, were not just brilliant educators. They were survivors of that older, wilder world. They had seen the worst of what magic could do, and they understood that if the wizarding world was to survive, it needed a new kind of institution. It needed a place where the old, dangerous knowledge could be contained, categorized, and taught in a controlled environment. Hogwarts was not the beginning of wizarding history. It was the end of the beginning. It was the moment when the scattered tribes of magic decided to build a wall against the chaos. And that wall was built from curriculum, from house rivalries, and from a carefully edited version of the past. And this is where the ghost of Professor Binns becomes so important. He is not just a boring teacher. He is the guardian of that wall. He represents the institutional memory of the school, the official record that has been polished and smoothed until it gleams with harmless facts. But a ghost is also a remnant. He is a piece of the past that refuses to move on. And if you listen closely, beyond the droning monotone of his lectures, you can hear the echoes of the world he is trying to forget. The Goblin Rebellions, which he teaches as a series of political disputes, were actually brutal wars of survival. The creation of the Chamber of Secrets, which he mentions as a historical footnote, was a direct result of the founders' inability to agree on how to handle the old magic. And the International Statute of Secrecy, which he presents as a simple legal agreement, was a desperate act of self-preservation that reshaped the entire magical world. The history that is taught at Hogwarts is a lie, but it is a necessary lie. It is a filter that allows young witches and wizards to learn about their heritage without being overwhelmed by the horror and the wonder of what came before. It is a way of taming the infinite, of reducing the terrifying complexity of ancient magic into a list of dates that can be memorized for an exam. But for those of us who are willing to look past the ghost and into the shadows he casts, there is a much deeper story waiting to be told. It is a story of the first wands, which were not made of wood and phoenix feather, but of bone, and the heartstrings of beasts that have long since vanished from the world. It is a story of the first cauldrons, which were not used for potions, but for divination and sacrifice. And it is a story of the first broomsticks, which were not ridden for sport, but as a desperate means of escape. This is the hidden history that the textbooks refuse to print. It is the history that exists in the gaps between the official dates, in the silence, after Professor Binns finishes his lecture and floats through the blackboard, leaving nothing but dust and the faint smell of old parchment. It is a history that begins not with a school, but with a single ancient craft that predates Hogwarts by thousands of years. A craft that is so fundamental to modern magic that we take it entirely for granted. A craft that, in its earliest form, was not a tool of convenience, but a weapon of survival. And that is where our true journey begins. Up next, we will step back into that forgotten age, to the time before the school, before the ministry, before the very concept of a wizard as we know it. We will explore the dawn of the wand, and the terrifying power that first awakened in the hands of those who dared to shape the raw stuff of magic into a tool of their own will. Professor Binns would have you believe that the history of magic is a simple procession of dates, a list of names and events to be memorized and forgotten the moment the exam is over. But the truth is far stranger, far older, and far more dangerous than any textbook could ever convey. We left off in that dusty, cold classroom where the ghost of a professor drones on about the formation of the Wizards' Council, and we realised that Hogwarts itself, for all its ancient stone and candlelight, is a relative newcomer. The magic that flows through its halls is a tamed, domesticated thing. But what came before? What was magic like when it was wild? To understand that, we have to go back. Back before the Ministry, before Hogwarts, before even the Wizards' Council had fully formed its grip on the magical world. We have to go back to a time when magic was not a tool to be wielded, but a force to be survived. A time when a wizard or witch was less a master of their craft and more a vessel for a chaotic, untamed energy that could just as easily heal a wound as it could set a forest ablaze. This was the age of wild magic, and it was an age of terror and wonder in equal measure. In this primordial state, magic was not channeled, it was not focused, it erupted. A young witch, frightened and angry, might cause a storm to break in her bedroom without meaning to. A wizard, attempting to mend a broken plough, might instead turn the entire field to glass. There was no precision, no control, no guarantee that the intent of the caster would match the outcome of the spell. It was a world of unpredictable, raw power, where magical folk were as much a danger to themselves as they were to the non-magical communities that feared them. This was the world into which the first wand makers stepped, and the most famous of them all, the family whose name would become synonymous with the craft itself, began their work in the year 382 before the Common Era.
The Ollivanders.
It is a date that feels impossibly remote, a time when the Roman Republic was still a fledgling experiment, and the Greek city-states were locked in their own struggles for dominance. Yet, somewhere in the misty prehistory of the British Isles, a family began to experiment with wood and core, with heartstrings and feathers and hair, trying to solve the most fundamental problem of the magical world: how to make the wild magic obey. The early wands were not the elegant, refined instruments in the hands of Harry Potter or Hermione Granger. They were crude things, often little more than a branch stripped of its bark, with a core of something powerful and dangerous tied to the end with sinew or thread. They were unpredictable, prone to backfiring, and they required a strength of will that most wizards simply did not possess. But they were a beginning. They were the first attempt to impose order on chaos. The transition from wandless, wild magic to the structured craft of wand-making was not a single event, but a slow, grinding revolution. It was a shift that took generations, and it was not without its casualties. The earliest wand-makers were often seen as heretics or fools, tampering with forces they did not fully understand, but they persisted. Driven by a vision of a world where magic could be a reliable servant rather than a terrifying master. The key insight, the discovery that would change everything, was the concept of the magical core. Before the wand, a wizard's power was diffuse, spread throughout their entire being. It was like trying to light a fire with a handful of sparks scattered across a wet forest floor. The wand, and specifically the core within it, acted as a lens. It gathered all those scattered sparks and focused them into a single, concentrated beam. It gave the caster a point of control, a handle by which they could grip the raw energy and direct it with intention. This was the dawn of the wand, and with it came a new kind of magic. A magic of precision, of subtlety, of craft. Spells could be cast with a flick and a word rather than a scream and a prayer. Potions could be brewed with exacting standards, rather than relying on a lucky combination of ingredients and a full moon. The world of magic began to take shape, to become a civilization rather than a collection of frightened, isolated individuals. But this progress came at a terrible cost. The invention of the wand created a class divide between magical beings that has never truly healed. Before the wand, power was raw and democratic. A witch with a natural talent for controlling her emotions might be more powerful than a wizard who was easily angered. The goblin's innate ability to work metal was a form of magic as potent as any human spell. The wand changed all of that. It became the great equalizer and the great separator. Those who could use a wand, primarily humans, gained an unprecedented level of control and power. They could cast spells faster, more accurately, and with far less personal risk than those who relied on wandless magic. The wand became the symbol of civilized magic, the mark of a true wizard, and those who could not or would not use a wand were pushed to the margins. Goblins, who had their own ancient and powerful magical traditions, refused to accept wand-based magic as superior. They saw it as a crutch, a tool of the weak, and a symbol of human arrogance. This fundamental disagreement over the nature of magic itself would fuel centuries of conflict, rebellion, and bloodshed. The wand did not just change how magic was cast, it changed who had power. It created a hierarchy, a system where the wand-wielding human stood at the top, and everyone else from house elves to centaurs to goblins was relegated to a lower tier. The very tool that gave the wizarding world its structure also sowed the seeds of its deepest divisions. So, when we look at the Ollivanders' shop in Diagon Alley with its neat rows of polished wands, we are looking at a monument to a revolution that tamed wild magic, but also built a wall between those who held the wand and those who did not. The first wands were not just tools, they were the first laws, The first boundaries, the first whispers of a society that would one day codify its prejudices into a statute of secrecy. And in the shadow of that first wand, in the flickering light of a forge from 382 before the Common Era, the first traditions of magical community began to form, traditions that would grow into covens, circles of witches and wizards who gathered not just for safety, but to share knowledge, to pass down the secrets of their newfound craft. The story of those ancient covens, and the first traditions they built, is a story of how a scattered people began to find their way home. And that is where our journey must take us next. Long before the first wand was carved from holly and phoenix feather, magic existed as a raw, untamed force, passed from parent to child in whispered words and half-remembered gestures. The year 382 before the Common Era marks the beginning of Ollivanders. But the story of organised magical society begins much earlier, in the shadows of isolated cottages and the dense cover of ancient forests. This is the age of hedge magic, when witches and wizards lived not in grand castles or hidden alleys, but on the fringes of Muggle settlements, their power a secret kept within bloodlines. You see, before there was a ministry of magic, before the Wizards' Council, before any formal institution of magical learning, the wizarding world was decentralized. Families with latent magical abilities would sometimes emerge in a single village, and they would learn to survive by keeping their gifts hidden. These were not the grand sorcerers of legend, but humble practitioners who used simple charms to mend a broken plough or coax a stubborn cow to give milk. They called it hedge magic because it thrived in the tangled, overgrown borders between farms and wild country, a place where Muggles rarely ventured. But as Muggle populations grew, and their superstitions hardened into fear, isolated magical families became vulnerable. A single witch could be outnumbered, outed, and burned at the stake if she lived too close to a suspicious neighbour. So they began to gather. Secret covens formed at the dark of the moon, in hidden clearings or beneath the roots of ancient oaks. These gatherings were not rituals of evil, as Muggle folklore later painted them, but meetings of survival, a chance to share protective charms, to warn one another of incoming danger, and to pass along the spells that had been handed down through generations without ever being written down. And that is the key difference between this early era and the later age of Hogwarts. There were no grimoires, no libraries of spellbooks. Instead, knowledge lived entirely in memory and voice. An elder witch would teach her granddaughter the incantation for a simple fire-making charm, repeating it over and over until the words were etched into the girl's bones. A wizard would whisper the secret of a disillusionment spell only to his eldest son, swearing him to silence. This oral tradition was both a protection and a limitation. It kept magic hidden from Muggles who might steal the knowledge, but it also meant that if a coven was wiped out, its entire magical heritage could vanish within a single generation. Still, the covens endured. They grew more organised, developing seasonal festivals that doubled as gatherings for trade and teaching. They learned to recognise other magical folk by subtle signs, the way a candle flame flickered when a witch passed by, or the peculiar shimmer of a wandless conjuration. They created a language of symbols scratched into tree bark and stone, a pre-literate code that could warn of danger or mark a safe meeting place. This was the true foundation of magical society, not in a school or a ministry, but in the quiet, persistent bond of families who trusted one another with the most dangerous secret of all. By the time the first wands began to circulate, these covens had already established a network of mutual protection that stretched across the British Isles. They knew which families could be trusted, which regions were safe, and which Muggle lords were particularly hostile to magic, and they guarded their traditions fiercely, because in a world without written laws or governance, the only guarantee of safety was the strength of one's coven. But as centuries passed, the need for something more than local alliances became undeniable. The covens could protect their own, but they could not prevent conflicts between magical families, nor could they represent the wizarding community in dealings with the Muggle world. The oral traditions that had preserved spellcraft for so long were now a limitation. Too many secrets were being lost, too many young witches and wizards growing up without proper training. It was in this gap between the old hedge magic and the need for structure that the Wizards' Council was born, a governing body that would attempt to unify the scattered covens, to codify the scattered spells, and to write down for the first time the laws that would shape the next 1,000 years of magical history. That story, the rise of the Wizards' Council and the dawn of formal magical governance, is exactly what we'll explore in the next chapter, because the ancient Covens had done their work. They had kept magic alive through the darkest centuries of persecution. Now it was time for the Wizards to build something that would outlast them all. The Covens of old were not a government. They were a patchwork of whispered alliances, a fragile network of families who trusted only their own bloodlines. For centuries, this was enough. A witch here, a wizard there, each coven operating as its own small kingdom, its own isolated world. But as the centuries passed, as the Muggle population swelled, and their villages crept closer to the hidden valleys and enchanted groves where magic dwelled, the old ways began to crack. The Covens could no longer pretend they were alone. Something had to change. And so, out of necessity, out of the slow-burning pressure of a world that was shrinking around them, the Wizards' Council was born. It was not a sudden revolution. There was no grand declaration, no single moment when the old order fell and a new one rose. Instead, it was a gradual, almost reluctant gathering of power. The heads of the most influential covens, the oldest families, the most powerful practitioners of the age, began to meet. At first, it was informal, a council of convenience, a way to settle disputes before they erupted into blood feuds that would draw Muggle attention. But over time, these meetings became regular, they became expected, and eventually they became law. The Wizards' Council was the longest-serving form of magical government before the Ministry, and it ruled for well over 1,000 years. But to call it a government in the modern sense would be misleading. It was not a bureaucracy. It had no departments, no official seals, no standardized system of justice. It was, at its heart, a council of elders, a gathering of the most respected and most feared magical figures in Britain. They met in secret, often in places deep underground or hidden within ancient forests, and their decisions were carried not by parchment and quill, but by word of mouth and the weight of their authority. If the council declared something, you obeyed, not because there was a police force to enforce, but because the alternative was to face the combined power of every witch and wizard who had sworn allegiance to the council's word. But maintaining order in a world without a centralized school was a constant struggle. The council had no way to standardize magical education, no way to ensure that every young witch or wizard learned the same basic principles of control and restraint. Magic was passed down through families, taught by parents to children, by masters to apprentices, and the quality of that teaching varied wildly. A child born into a powerful old family might learn advanced charms before they were 10 years old, while a child from a remote coven might barely be able to light a candle without setting the whole house on fire. This uneven distribution of knowledge created a dangerous imbalance. Wizards who had been poorly trained were more likely to lose control, more likely to perform accidental magic that terrified Muggles, more likely to break the very secrecy that the council was trying to preserve. And then there was the question of territory. The Covens had always claimed their own lands, their own hunting grounds, their own sources of rare magical ingredients. But as the council tried to impose a broader order, these ancient claims began to clash. A family that had harvested moonstone from a particular cliff for 5 generations did not take kindly to being told that the cliff now belonged to the council's jurisdiction. Disputes that had once been settled by duels or by quiet negotiation now had to be brought before the council. And the council's judgments were not always accepted gracefully. There were grudges that lasted for decades, feuds that simmered beneath the surface of polite magical society, waiting for the slightest provocation to boil over. The chaotic early laws regarding magical creatures and territory only made things worse. The council, in its wisdom, attempted to codify the relationship between wizards and the non-human magical beings that shared their world. But these laws were often contradictory, hastily written, and enforced unevenly. One decree might grant a tribe of Centaurs the right to roam freely through a certain forest, while another decree, passed only a few years later, would declare that same forest a protected wizarding preserve, forbidding any non-human from entering without permission. The Centaurs, of course, ignored the decree entirely, and the council lacked the power to evict them. The goblins, too, were a constant source of tension. Their ancient agreements with the wizarding families were and often violated, leading to disputes that could fester for generations. The council tried to mediate, but its members were often biased, favouring their own kind over the creatures they saw as lesser. It was in this environment of fragile order and simmering conflict that the first real attempts at magical law enforcement emerged. The council appointed certain trusted individuals to act as its eyes and ears, to travel between the Covens and report back on any violations of the council's decrees. These early enforcers were the ancestors of the Auras, but they had none of the training, none of the standardized protocols, none of the support structure that would later define the ministry's law enforcement. They were often alone, often outmatched, and often forced to rely on their own wits and their own power to settle disputes. Some of them became legends in their own right, figures whose names were whispered in awe and fear. Others disappeared into the wilderness, their fates unknown, their bodies never found, and through it all, the council struggled to hold the magical world together. It was a world of ancient grudges and shifting alliances, of powerful families who answered to no one, and creatures who refused to be tamed. The council was not a solution to these problems. It was a bandage, a temporary measure, a way to keep the bleeding from becoming fatal. But it worked after a fashion. For over 1,000 years, the Wizards' Council kept the magical world from tearing itself apart. It preserved the secrecy that protected wizards from Muggle persecution. It laid the groundwork for the laws and institutions that would later become the Ministry of Magic. And it kept the peace, however fragile that peace might have been. But the Council's greatest weakness was its inability to educate. Without a centralized school, without a place where young witches and wizards could be taught together, the old divisions remained. The Covens remained isolated, the families remained suspicious of outsiders, and the magical world remained fractured. A collection of separate pieces that never quite fit together. The council knew that something had to change, but it did not know what. It did not know that the answer was already being born, in the bloodlines of a family whose name would echo through the ages. A family whose legacy would shape the very foundations of magical history. That family was the Peverells, and their story, the story of the Peverell Legacy, is a tale of power, of ambition, and of a secret so profound that it would be whispered for centuries. A secret that would eventually find its way into the hands of three brothers who changed the world forever. The Wizards' Council governed for centuries, but they governed a world still steeped in the old legends, the ones that predated any law or council, and among those legends, none cast a longer shadow than the story of three brothers who cheated death. You know the tale, of course. It is the one Beadle the Bard wrote down, the one Hermione Granger would later dismiss as a children's fable, but the truth is far older and far more unsettling than a bedtime story. The Peverell Legacy is not a myth. It is a historical footprint left in the soil of the 13th century. Let us set the stage. The year is roughly 1290. The place is the River Peverell, a small waterway that winds through the English countryside. The historical reality behind the tale of the three brothers is not a story of death personified, but a story of three very real, very powerful wizards. Antioch, Cadmus, and Ignotus Peverell, they were not brothers in the sense of a single mother and father. They were brothers in craft, in ambition, in bloodline, and they lived at a time when the line between magic and mortality was dangerously thin. The 13th century was a brutal century for the wizarding world. Muggle witch hunts were not yet at their peak, But the seeds of persecution were being sown. The church grew stronger. Fear of the unknown spread like a sickness, and in response, many wizards retreated into the shadows, hoarding their knowledge, protecting their families. The Peverells were different. They did not hide. They sought to master the very forces that made others afraid. Antioch Peverell was the eldest, or at least the most reckless. He was a duelist, a wand-maker of terrifying skill. He believed that power was the only shield worth carrying, and so he crafted a wand from elder wood, a wood long associated with both death and rebirth. He poured his own life force into it, his aggression, his will to dominate. The wand became an extension of his very soul. It was not just a tool, it was a weapon that could not be matched. And Antioch, drunk on his own creation, boasted that he had made a wand that had never been defeated. He claimed it was unbeatable. He was wrong. Cadmus Peverell was the middle brother. He was a scholar, a man who had lost someone he loved more than magic itself. Grief is a powerful motivator, and Cadmus was driven by a desperate need to reverse the irreversible. He turned to the oldest branch of magic, necromancy. But he was not a grave robber. He was an alchemist. He believed that death was not an end, but a state of matter that could be transformed. He worked with stones, with minerals, with the very building blocks of the earth, and he created a stone that could call back the echoes of the dead, not truly resurrect them, but pull their shadows into the world of the living. It was a stone of memory, of unfinished business, of love twisted into obsession. Ignotus Peverell was the youngest and the wisest. He had seen what power did to Antioch. He had seen what grief did to Cadmus. He wanted neither. He wanted peace. He wanted to move through the world without being seen, without being hunted. He was a master of disillusionment charms, of concealment, of the subtle arts. But he wanted something more permanent, something that could not be dispelled. He wove a cloak from the hair of a demiguise, a creature that could turn invisible at will. But he did not stop there. He layered it with enchantment so old, so deep, that the cloak became something more than a magical object. It became a part of the fabric of reality. It was a cloak that could hide you from death itself. Not because it made you invincible, but because it made you impossible to find. And here is where the legend and the history diverge. The tale says death gave them these objects. The truth is far more human. The three brothers did not meet death on a bridge. They met each other in a clearing, and they argued. Antioch wanted to conquer. Cadmus wanted to resurrect. Ignotus wanted to disappear. They were three paths, three philosophies, three ways of facing the same fear, and they each chose differently. Antioch's wand, the Elder Wand, did not stay with him long. He was killed in his sleep by a rival who wanted its power. The wand passed from hand to hand, each new master more paranoid than the last. It became a cursed object, a thing of legend, a weapon that promised victory but delivered only violence. It travelled through medieval Europe, leaving a trail of blood. It was held by wizards who called themselves masters, who thought they had conquered fate, but the wand always chose the next hand, and that hand was always reaching for a throat. Cadmus's stone, the resurrection stone, was more subtle. He used it to call back his lost love, but she was not real. She was a shade, a memory, a cold echo. She begged him to let her go, to stop pulling her from the peace of the grave. But Cadmus could not listen. He held the stone until it drove him mad. He eventually took his own life, hoping to join her in the world beyond. The stone was lost, buried with him, or perhaps hidden by someone who understood its danger. Ignotus' cloak, the invisibility cloak, was different. It did not corrupt. It protected. Ignotus lived a long life, a quiet life. He passed the cloak to his son, and his son to his son, and so on down the centuries. The cloak became the Peverell family heirloom, a symbol of their wisdom, their restraint. It was not used for conquest or for grief. It was used for escape, for survival, for the simple act of being left alone. Tracing the lineage of the cloak, the stone, and the wand through medieval Europe is like following a river that splits into three streams. The wand went one way, into the hands of warlords and tyrants. The stone went another, into the earth, into the darkness of forgotten tombs. The cloak stayed with the family, passed from generation to generation, always hidden, always waiting. By the time the Peverell name faded from history, the objects had become legend. The Elder Wand was known as the Death Stick, the Wand of Destiny. The Resurrection Stone was called the Stone of Resurrection, the Hallow of the Dead. The cloak was simply the Cloak of Invisibility, the most perfect of its kind. And the story of the three brothers became a fairy tale, a warning, a piece of folklore that mothers told their children to keep them from seeking too much power. But the distinction between the mythic death and the high-level alchemy of the Hallows is crucial. The Hallows were not gifts from a supernatural entity. They were the products of extraordinary magical craftsmanship, of alchemy pushed to its absolute limit. The Peverells were not the only ones who attempted such feats. There were others in other parts of the world who tried to create objects that could bend reality, but the Peverells succeeded, and their success became their curse. The Hallows represent the three great desires of the human heart: power, love, and peace. And each one, when taken to its extreme, becomes a trap. Antioch wanted power, and it killed him. Cadmus wanted love, and it destroyed him. Ignotus wanted peace, and he found it, but only by letting go of everything else. So when you hear the tale of the three brothers, remember that it is not just a story, it is a history lesson, written in blood and bone and elder wood. The Peverell Legacy is not about cheating death. It is about understanding that death cannot be cheated. It can only be delayed or denied or accepted, and the choice, as always, is yours. The cloak, the stone, and the wand are still out there, somewhere. They have been scattered, hidden, lost, but they have not been destroyed. They cannot be destroyed. They are the echoes of three brothers who dared to reach for the impossible, and their legacy will continue to haunt the wizarding world long after the last candle has burned out. But the Peverells were not the only ones who left their mark on the centuries. As the 13th century gave way to the 14th, a new darkness was rising. The Muggle world was changing. Fear was becoming law, and the wizarding world, already fractured and secretive, was about to face its greatest trial yet. The age of persecution was coming. The Peverell legend, as it wove itself into the fabric of the 13th century, left behind more than just three heirlooms. It left behind a story that spoke to the deepest fears and the most profound hopes of the magical world. But even as the brothers, Ignotus, Antioch, and Cadmus were living out their fates, a shadow was beginning to stretch across the whole of Europe. It was a shadow that would eventually touch every witch and wizard, every goblin and house elf, every magical creature that dared to breathe the same air as the non-magical population. This was the shadow of persecution. The rising tensions between Muggles and wizards in the Middle Ages were not a sudden explosion of hatred. They were a slow, creeping poison, a mist that gathered over centuries. In the early days, before the great witch hunts, the relationship between the two worlds was more complicated. There were healers who were welcomed into villages, wise women whose knowledge of herbs and potions was sought after. There were wizards who lived openly, their magic seen as a gift, a blessing from the divine. But as the centuries passed, as the church grew in power, and the fear of the unknown became a tool of control, that fragile trust began to erode. The non-magical world, in its struggle to understand the inexplicable, began to see magic not as a gift, but as a threat, a crop failure, a sudden illness, a stillborn child. All of these could be blamed on the local witch or wizard. The whispers started in the villages, passed from ear to ear. She turned the milk sour. He cursed the harvest. The children of the forest, they said. They danced with the devil, and the fear, once planted, grew like a briar, thorny and relentless. The magical community, which had once walked freely among their Muggle neighbours, began to withdraw. They retreated into the shadows, into the deep woods, into the hidden corners of the world. They built their homes behind wards and enchantments, hoping to be forgotten, but they were not forgotten. The witch hunts of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period were a systematic brutal campaign of terror. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of innocent muggles were burned, drowned, and hanged on charges of witchcraft. But the magical community was not immune. Witches and wizards were caught in the same net, their accidental magic or their deliberate acts of self-defense marking them as targets. The psychological impact of the witch hunts on the magical collective consciousness was profound. It was a trauma that would shape their society for generations. Imagine the constant gnawing fear, the knowledge that at any moment a neighbour could turn informant, that a simple spell cast to light a fire could bring the mob to your door. The magical world learned to live in a state of siege. They developed elaborate codes of secrecy, passwords, and hidden passages. They taught their children to suppress their magic in public, to hide their true nature. The very act of being a witch or a wizard became a crime, a secret that had to be guarded with your life. This fear, this constant vigilance, it seeped into the magical soul. It created a culture of paranoia, of deep-seated distrust toward the non-magical world. It is the reason why, even centuries later, the Ministry of Magic would go to such extreme lengths to maintain the Statute of Secrecy. And yet, within this crucible of fear, a strange and darkly humorous defiance emerged. Consider the case of Wendelin the Weird. Wendelin was a witch who, according to the records, was burned at the stake no fewer than 47 times. But here is the crucial detail. She was not a victim. She enjoyed it. Wendelin the Weird, as she came to be known, would deliberately allow herself to be captured by Muggle authorities. She would stand trial, be condemned, and then be led to the pyre. And as the flames were lit, she would perform a simple flame-freezing charm, a spell that turned the roaring fire into a pleasant, tickling warmth. She would stand there, in the middle of the inferno, laughing and enjoying the spectacle. The Muggles, of course, believed they were watching a heretic burn. They saw the smoke, they heard the crackling of the fire, and they saw her body seemingly consumed. But Wendelin would simply apparate away at the last moment, leaving behind a pile of ashes and a bewildered crowd. Now, what does this tell us about the magical psyche of the time? On the surface, it is a story of magical superiority. It is a wizard laughing in the face of Muggle ignorance, a demonstration of power that seems almost cruel. Wendelin was not just surviving the witch hunts, she was mocking them. She was turning the ultimate symbol of Muggle persecution into a carnival ride. But look a little deeper, and you see something else. You see a profound sense of alienation. Wendelin's actions were not just a prank, they were a statement. She was saying, "Your fear of me is so laughable, your methods so primitive, that I can stand in the middle of your greatest weapon and feel nothing but amusement." It is the arrogance of the hunted, who knows he cannot be caught. It is a defense mechanism, a way of coping with the terror by turning it into a joke. But the joke for many was not funny. The majority of the magical community did not share Wendelin's carefree attitude. They saw the stakes, quite literally, and they were terrified. The constant threat of exposure, the need to hide, the loss of friends and family to the flames. This was a trauma that would never fully heal. It created a deep, almost instinctual fear of the Muggle world. It made the magical community insular, secretive, and paranoid. They built their own world, a world hidden behind walls of enchantment, a world where they could be safe. But that safety came at a cost. They lost the ability to live openly, to share their gifts, to be part of the larger human story. They became a hidden kingdom, a secret society, a people living in the shadows of their own history. And it was in this atmosphere of fear and defiance, of persecution and hidden strength, that the need for a new kind of institution became undeniable. The scattered covens, the isolated families, the Wizards' Council, they were no longer enough. The magical world needed a place of sanctuary, a place of learning, a place where the next generation could be trained not just in spells, but in the art of survival. It needed a fortress of knowledge, a beacon in the darkness. And as the flames of the witch hunts continued to burn across Europe, 4 individuals were beginning to dream of a different future. They were visionaries, each with their own idea of what that future should look like, and their names, as you might have guessed, were Godric, Salazar, Rowena, and Helga. Their story is the story of how Hogwarts was born, and it is a story that begins not in a castle, but in the ashes of a world that had nearly destroyed them. The centuries of persecution had carved deep wounds into the magical world. Families had learned to trust no one, to hide their children in attics and root cellars whenever a neighbour fell ill or a crop failed. The fear was not just of fire and rope, but of erosion, the slow wearing away of oral traditions, the loss of ancient spells, the scattering of covens that had once gathered under the oaks of Avalon. By the late 10th century, the wizarding population of Britain was fractured, anxious, and desperately in need of a new kind of hope. It was into this world that four extraordinary individuals converged, not by accident, but by a shared recognition that something fundamental had to change. They came from different corners of the land, bearing different philosophies and different magical temperaments. Godric Gryffindor, a warrior sorcerer from the windswept moors of the West Country, whose courage was matched only by his fierce belief that magic should be a force for good in the open. Rowena Ravenclaw, a scholar from the misty glens of Scotland, whose mind held more ancient runes and forgotten charms than any library could contain. Helga Hufflepuff, a healer and gatherer from the broad valleys of Wales, whose loyalty to the outcast and the overlooked was legendary among the scattered communities she had quietly protected. And Salazar Slytherin, a master of subtlety and ambition from the fens of East Anglia, whose understanding of magical lineage and inherited power was unmatched. They came together in a time of global unrest, witch hunts spreading like fire across Europe, muggles turning on their own neighbours, and magical folk growing desperate for sanctuary. The meeting itself is not recorded in any single document. No charter, no parchment signed by four hands. It exists instead in the whispered accounts passed down through generations, in the shapes of stained glass at Hogwarts, in the carvings on the walls of the oldest corridors. What we know, or what we believe, is that they gathered in the Scottish Highlands, a place that had long been a refuge for magical beings. The mountains there were old, older than the Romans, older than the Druids, older than the memory of human settlement. They were places where the veil between worlds thinned, where ley lines converged like veins of quartz beneath the earth. The geographical significance of the Scottish Highlands as a magical sanctuary cannot be overstated. Its deep glens provided cover, its lochs held creatures that had never been catalogued, its peaks were natural observatories for the stars, and the land itself seemed to hum with a quiet power that warded off the curious and the cruel. It was there, perhaps on a summer evening, when the sun set late and golden over the heather, that the Four Visionaries spoke of a radical idea, not a coven, not a fortress, not a hidden village, but a school, a unified institution of magical education, where children from all backgrounds could come together to learn, not to be hidden away, but to be trained, to be protected not just by walls, but by knowledge. The radical idea of a unified magical education to protect the young was born from the recognition that isolation was not safety, it was slow death. The Covens had kept the traditions alive, but they had also kept them small, exclusive, vulnerable to a single betrayal. A school, however, could be a fortress of learning, a place where the most powerful minds could teach the next generation not only spells, but wisdom, where the children could forge bonds of friendship that would last a lifetime, bonds stronger than the fear that had kept their parents apart. Each founder brought their own vision to the table. Gryffindor argued for courage, that a wizard must be willing to stand up for what is right, even against overwhelming odds. Ravenclaw insisted on the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, believing that the highest magic came from the deepest understanding. Hufflepuff demanded inclusion, that the school should accept any child who showed magical ability, regardless of bloodline or background, and Slytherin spoke of ambition and cunning, of the need for resourcefulness, In a world that would never fully accept magic, they did not always agree. In fact, they rarely agreed, but they shared one conviction: that the future of wizardkind depended on creating a place where the next generation could grow up without the constant shadow of the pyre, a place where they could be children first and wizards second. The decision to build in the Highlands was not arbitrary. The location had to be remote enough to avoid Muggle discovery, yet accessible enough for families to send their children. It had to be saturated in ancient magic, where the very stones remembered the old ways, and it had to be defensible, not from other wizards, but from the ignorance that sought to extinguish magic from the world. The Highlands offered all of that. The mountains themselves became the first ward, the mist that clung to the valleys became the second, and the founders poured their own power into the land. Weaving enchantments that would make the castle they envisioned invisible to those who did not belong. They began to build, not with stone and mortar alone, but with intention. Every corridor, every tower, every hidden chamber was designed to reflect the values they held dear. Gryffindor's tower would face the sunrise, symbolizing boldness and new beginnings. Ravenclaw's tower would be the highest, reaching toward the stars where answers dwelled. Hufflepuff's domain would be near the kitchens and the earth, warm and welcoming, and Slytherin's common room would lie beneath the lake in the depths, where secrets are kept and power is forged. The castle itself would become a living thing, its staircases shifting, its doors opening only to those who proved worthy. It would be a testament to the belief that magic was not something to be feared, but something to be nurtured, guided, and shared. But even as the walls rose, the founders knew that bricks and spells alone would not ensure survival. The true protection would come from the community they built inside. The houses they created were not just dormitories, they were families. They were the promise that no child would ever be alone again. And in that promise, the foundations of a new wizarding world were laid. As the first stones were set in place, as the foundations sank deep into the roots of the Highland earth, the Four Visionaries stood together for a brief, almost sacred moment. They knew that what they were creating would outlive them. They knew that disagreements would arise, that the very house system they designed might one day foster division rather than unity. But they also knew that hope, real tangible hope, was a rarer and more powerful magic than any spell. And so they built, stone by stone, spell by spell, into the quiet hills of Scotland, crafting a sanctuary that would endure for 1,000 years and more. The castle was taking shape, but it was not yet alive. That would come next. When the founders breathed their own essence into the stone, when they bound the very fabric of the building to the land and to the sky, the true story of how Hogwarts became a living castle with its own will and its own memory is a tale of artistry and sacrifice, of spells that have never been replicated, and of a bond between creators and creation that transcends death itself. The four founders had gathered their first students, but they had no school. They had a vision of unity, a radical plan to protect the young and preserve magical knowledge. But they stood on a windswept Scottish hillside with nothing but an idea. The castle of Hogwarts did not exist yet, and building it would require more than stone and mortar. It would require a kind of architectural magic that had never been attempted before. You see, the founders were not merely constructing a fortress. They were building a living thing. They understood that a school for magic could not be a static structure, a lifeless collection of corridors and classrooms. It had to breathe. It had to think. It had to respond to the needs of its inhabitants. And so they set out to create something that had never been built in the history of the wizarding world: a sentient castle. The architectural magic required to create a sentient, shifting fortress was ancient and deeply personal. It drew upon traditions that predated the founders themselves. Spells and enchantments passed down through families for generations. Godric Gryffindor contributed his knowledge of defensive magic, weaving protective wards into the very foundations. Rowena Ravenclaw brought her understanding of the mind, crafting charms that would allow the castle to perceive and remember. Helga Hufflepuff infused the stones with a sense of welcome and belonging, ensuring that every student who crossed the threshold would feel a measure of comfort. And Salazar Slytherin, ever the pragmatist, added layers of cunning and secrecy, creating hidden passages and chambers that would only reveal themselves to those who knew how to ask. But the most remarkable aspect of this construction was the way the founders infused their own personalities into the stones of Hogwarts. This was not a matter of mere decoration or symbolic architecture. It was a literal embedding of their essence into the castle's very structure. Each founder poured a part of themselves into the walls, the staircases, the ceilings. The result was a building that reflected their individual natures as surely as a mirror reflects a face. Gryffindor's influence can be felt in the grand, sweeping staircases that seem to dare you to climb them, in the bold, unyielding stonework that has weathered centuries without crumbling. Ravenclaw's presence lingers in the ever-changing riddles carved into the door frames, in the tower that reaches toward the sky like a question mark. Hufflepuff's warmth radiates from the kitchens, from the cozy nooks where students gather by the fire, from the sense that the castle itself wants you to feel at home. And Slytherin's legacy is etched into the shadows, into the passages that twist and turn like a serpent's coils, into the places where secrets are kept safe. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The founders had planned for many things. They had planned for the castle to shift its staircases, to hide its rooms, to protect its students. But they had not planned for the Room of Requirement. The mystery of the Room of Requirement as an unplanned magical anomaly is one of the most fascinating aspects of Hogwarts creation. No one knows exactly when it first appeared. Some believe it emerged spontaneously during the early years of the school, a byproduct of the immense concentration of magical energy required to animate the castle. Others think it was always there, a hidden pocket of space that the founders themselves never discovered. What is certain is that the Room of Requirement was not part of the original design. It is a sentient space within a sentient castle, a room that exists only when someone needs it. It can become a library, a training ground, a hiding place, a bathroom, a forest, a room full of chamber pots. It adapts to the desires of the person who walks past it 3 times, concentrating on what they require. This is magic of the highest order, magic that seems to think for itself, magic that suggests the castle is more alive than even its creators intended. Some historians argue that the Room of Requirement is evidence of a deeper intelligence within Hogwarts, a consciousness that grew and evolved over time. The founders had given the castle the ability to change, but they had not given it the ability to create. And yet the Room of Requirement creates. It invents spaces that never existed before, tailored to the specific needs of each individual. This is not a simple charm. This is something closer to a living mind. Think about what that means. The castle is not just a building that remembers. It is a building that anticipates. It is a building that cares. When a student is lost, the staircases shift to guide them. When a student is in danger, the walls seem to close in to protect them. When a student is desperate, the Room of Requirement appears. This is not cold mechanical magic. This is the magic of a home that loves its inhabitants. And yet, there is a shadow side to this sentience. The castle's personality is not uniform. It reflects the founders' own divisions, their disagreements, their unresolved conflicts. Gryffindor's boldness sometimes clashes with Slytherin's caution. Ravenclaw's logic can seem cold against Hufflepuff's warmth. The castle is a living argument, a debate in stone and spellwork. And as the years passed, that argument grew more intense. The founders had built a living castle, but they had not built a unified one. The stones remembered their creators' passions, their fears, their ambitions, and those memories would eventually tear the school apart. The Great Schism was coming, and the castle itself would bear witness to the fracture. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, let us rest in the knowledge that Hogwarts was not merely built, it was born. It was given life by 4 extraordinary witches and wizards who poured their souls into every brick, every beam, every breath of enchanted air, and in doing so, they created something that would outlast them, something that would remember them, something that would continue to grow and change long after they were gone. The castle of Hogwarts is not a monument to the past. It is a living being, shaped by the hands of its creators, but alive with a will of its own. And as we prepare to explore the next chapter of this hidden history, the Great Schism, we must remember that the cracks in the foundation were there from the very beginning. The founders built a home for magic, but they could not build a home for peace. The castle was alive. It breathed, shifted, and grew with the intentions of its creators. But a living thing cannot survive without a soul. And the soul of Hogwarts was never truly unified. The 4 founders had poured their magic into stone and staircases, but they had poured their beliefs into the very air of the corridors, and those beliefs were beginning to clash like storm clouds over the Black Lake. The ideological fallout between Salazar Slytherin and the other 3 founders did not happen overnight. It was not a single argument that shattered their fellowship. It was a slow, corrosive drip of distrust that began the moment they disagreed on who deserved to walk those shifting hallways. Godric Gryffindor believed in courage above all, in the raw potential of a brave heart regardless of blood. Rowena Ravenclaw valued wit and wisdom, seeking minds sharp enough to unlock the secrets of the universe. Helga Hufflepuff accepted all who were loyal and hard-working, asking only for fairness and effort. But Salazar Slytherin looked at the world outside their walls and saw something the others refused to acknowledge. He saw the burnings. He saw the hunts. He saw muggles dragging witches from their homes. Not because they had done evil, but because they were different. And in his mind, the only defense against that kind of hatred was purity, not just of blood, but of purpose. He believed that muggle-born witches and wizards were a vulnerability, a crack in the armour, through which the muggle world could seep in and destroy everything they had built. It was not simple bigotry, though it certainly wore that mask. It was a reaction born of trauma, of watching your own kind hunted like animals by people who could not understand them. The pure blood obsession was a reaction to muggle aggression, not just bigotry. It was a desperate, misguided attempt to fortify the magical world against an enemy that could never be reasoned with. Gryffindor argued that courage could not be inherited. Ravenclaw insisted that wisdom had no lineage. Hufflepuff reminded him that every witch and wizard, regardless of origin, deserved a chance to prove their worth. But Slytherin saw their compassion as naivety. He saw the future, and in that future, he believed the Muggle-born would always be a bridge for persecution. He could not convince them, and they could not convince him. The schism deepened until the very stones of Hogwarts seemed to groan under the weight of their disagreement. And so, Salazar Slytherin made a choice that would echo through 1,000 years. He did not leave quietly. He did not simply walk away from the school he had helped build. Instead, he engaged in the secret construction of the Chamber of Secrets as an act of historical defiance. It was not a tantrum. It was a statement carved into the foundations of the castle itself. He built a hidden chamber, deep beneath the lake, sealed by magic so ancient and so personal that only his true heir could open it. And inside that chamber, he left a piece of himself. Not a portrait, not a book, but a living monster, a basilisk, the king of serpents, a creature of such lethal power that a single glance could end a life. This was his final argument, his last word in a debate that had torn their fellowship apart. He believed that one day the world would prove him right, that the Muggle-born would bring ruin, and that his heir would need the means to purge the school of those he considered unworthy. The chamber was not built in anger alone. It was built in certainty, the certainty that history would vindicate him, and that the school he loved would one day need to be saved from itself. When Slytherin left, the other founders did not speak of him. They sealed the knowledge of his departure into silence, hoping that time would heal the wound, but the wound festered. The house system, which had been designed to foster friendly competition and mutual respect, became a vessel for the very division Slytherin had preached. His students carried his beliefs forward, whispering them in the common room, passing them down through generations. The chamber became a legend, a rumour, a threat that parents told their children to keep them in line. But it was real, it was waiting. The castle that had been built as a sanctuary for all magical children now held a secret designed to destroy some of them. And that contradiction, that hidden violence beneath the surface of Hogwarts, would define the school's relationship with its own history for centuries to come. The founders had created a home for magic, but they had also planted the seed of its darkest conflict. The Sorting Hat, that old relic of Gryffindor's genius, would one day sing of this very tension. It would remind the students that Hogwarts was built by four, and that the loss of one had left a scar on the soul of the school. But before the hat could sing its warnings, before it could weave the story of the founders into verse, it had to be made. And the magic that went into its creation was as complex and as personal as the chamber itself. That story, the story of the Sorting Hat's first song, is one of the most misunderstood pieces of Hogwarts lore, and it reveals more about the founders than any history book ever could. The fallout from the Great Schism left Hogwarts in a fragile state. Salazar Slytherin had vanished into the shadows, taking with him his vision of pureblood supremacy and leaving behind a legacy of distrust that would fester for centuries. The other three founders were left to pick up the pieces, to rebuild not just the school's reputation, but its very soul. They knew that the rift had exposed a dangerous truth. A single leader, no matter how wise or powerful, could become a point of failure for the entire institution. If one founder could fall to such extremism, what would happen when they were all gone? The answer lay in a radical act of delegation, a magical contract that would outlive them all. It was Godric Gryffindor who proposed the solution, though. It came from a place of humility rather than pride. He understood that his own judgment, while fierce and noble, was not infallible. He had trusted Slytherin for years, had called him a friend, and had been blind to the darkness growing in his heart. So Gryffindor turned to an unlikely object, his own hat. It was a simple, battered thing, worn from years of battle and travel, but it held a spark of his own magic. He asked Rowena Ravenclaw, the most brilliant witch of their age, to enchant it with a piece of her own intellect. He asked Helga Hufflepuff to infuse it with her unerring sense of fairness. Together, they wove a spell that would make the hat a living artifact, a vessel for the founders' collective wisdom. The enchantment of Gryffindor's hat was not a simple charm. It was a delegation of judgment itself. The hat would become the Sorting Hat, a sentient entity capable of reading the minds and hearts of every student who entered Hogwarts. It would see potential where the founders might have missed it, loyalty where prejudice might have blinded them, and ambition where fear might have suppressed it. The hat was designed to be impartial, to weigh the values of each house against the soul of each child, and to place them where they would grow the strongest. This was not a system of convenience. It was a safeguard against the very human flaw of favoritism. The founders knew that they could not be present forever, that their own biases would fade with time, but the hat would remain constant. The house system itself was the founders' masterstroke of governance. They had created 4 distinct communities within the castle, each with its own culture, its own values, and its own leadership. Gryffindor valued courage, Ravenclaw wisdom, Hufflepuff loyalty, and Slytherin ambition. By dividing the students, they ensured that no single ideology could dominate the school. If one house fell to corruption, the other 3 would stand as a check against it. This was a deliberate design to prevent a single point of failure in leadership. The founders had learned from Slytherin's betrayal that power concentrated in one hand was a danger. The house system distributed that power across 4 pillars: each one a counterweight to the others. The sorting hat would ensure that the balance was maintained, that each house received the students who would strengthen its unique character. In the early years of the school, the founders were still active teachers. They walked the corridors, taught their own classes, and watched their houses grow. Godric Gryffindor could be found in the training yards, sparring with students and teaching them the art of dueling. Rowena Ravenclaw held court in her tower, challenging the brightest minds with riddles and philosophical debates. Helga Hufflepuff worked in the kitchens, teaching the value of hard work and community, often inviting the most homesick students to share a meal with her. Even Salazar Slytherin, before his fall, had taught the dark arts with a precision that few could match. The school was alive with their presence, a living extension of their personalities. But they knew that this golden age would not last. They were mortal, and the school would outlive them. The Sorting Hat's first song was not a song at all, at least not in the way we think of it today. It was a declaration, a spoken oath that the hat recited at the first sorting ceremony after the founders' deaths. The hat sang of the four founders, their virtues and their flaws. It warned of the dangers of division and the strength of unity. It told the students that they were not just members of a house, but guardians of a legacy. The song changed over the centuries, adapting to the times, but its core message remained the same. The hat was the voice of the founders, and it would never let their vision be forgotten. The enchantment was so powerful that the hat could even call for help in times of crisis, as it would do centuries later when it summoned the Sword of Gryffindor to a true heir. The delegation of judgment to the hat was a profound act of trust. The founders were essentially saying that their own wisdom, however great, was not enough. They needed a tool that could see beyond the surface, that could recognize the potential in a child who might otherwise be overlooked. This was the true genius of the house system. It was not just about sorting students into neat categories. It was about creating a self-correcting ecosystem. If a student was placed in the wrong house, the hat could sense it and adjust. If a house became too powerful, the other houses would rise to challenge it. The system was designed to evolve, to adapt, and to endure it did. The Sorting Hat has been singing its song for over 1,000 years, through wars, rebellions, and the rise and fall of Dark Lords. It has seen the best and worst of wizarding kind, and it has never wavered in its duty. The founders' wisdom, encoded in that deathful hat, has protected Hogwarts from the very fractures that once threatened to destroy it. But the school was not the only institution to emerge from this era. As the founders laid the foundations of magical education, another tradition was taking shape in the skies above the British countryside. The game of Quidditch, with its chaotic beauty and its own set of ancient rules, was about to enter the historical record in a way that would forever change wizarding sport. That story, the tale of medieval Quidditch and the Golden Snidget, is one we will explore in the next chapter. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The Sorting Hat had sung its first song, and the four founders had woven their judgment into a simple piece of fabric, ensuring that Hogwarts would endure beyond their own lives. But while the castle stood as a beacon of organised magical learning, the world outside its walls continued to evolve in ways that were far less structured, far more chaotic, and often far more brutal. The wizarding world did not stop its forward march simply because a school had been built. In fact, some of the most enduring traditions of magical society were being forged in the muddy fields and misty marshes of medieval Britain, far from the stone corridors of Hogwarts. It is in this context that we must turn our attention to a peculiar patch of land in the north of England, a place known simply as Quidditch Marsh. The name itself is ancient, predating the formal organisation of magical sport by several centuries. And it is here, in the damp, reedy landscape of the 11th century that we find the earliest recorded origins of what would one day become the most beloved and chaotic game in the wizarding world. The story begins not with a rulebook or a governing body, but with a diary. A witch named Gertie Kettle, who lived in a small cottage on the edge of the marsh, kept meticulous records of the strange and violent pastimes she witnessed among the local magical folk. Her diaries, now preserved in the archives of the Ministry of Magic, offer us a window into a time when broomstick flight was still a relatively new and unstable art, and when the concept of a regulated sport was utterly alien. In Gertie's time, the early 11th century, broomsticks were not the sleek, polished instruments of controlled flight that we know today. They were crude, often uncomfortable, and notoriously difficult to steer. A typical broom from this era might be made from a bundle of twigs tied to a gnarled branch, with no charm for cushioning or stabilization. The rider had to rely on sheer willpower, a strong grip, and a great deal of luck to stay aloft. It was a mode of transport for the brave, the reckless, or the desperate, and it was on these primitive brooms that the earliest version of Quidditch was played. But to call it Quidditch at this stage would be generous. What Gertie Kettle described in her diary was less a game and more a chaotic free-for-all, a brutal contest of endurance and aggression played over the treacherous terrain of the marsh. There were no hoops, no goals, no referees, and certainly no point system. The objective was simple, and it was savage. Catch the Golden Snidget. The Golden Snidget was a small, agile, golden-feathered bird, renowned for its incredible speed and its ability to change direction in the blink of an eye. It was not native to the marsh, but it was frequently spotted there, drawn perhaps by the insects that thrived in the damp air. For the local wizards and witches, hunting the Snidget became a popular pastime, and it did not take long for this hunt to evolve into a competitive spectacle. Imagine the scene, if you will, not as a pleasant daydream, but as a historical reality. A dozen or more riders, mounted on their unreliable brooms, would gather at the edge of the marsh. A Snidget would be released from a cage, and at the signal, the hunt would begin. The rules, such as they were non-existent. You could grab, push, or even curse your opponent out of the sky. The only thing that mattered was being the one to catch the bird, and you had to catch it alive, for the Snidget's value was in its living form. The bird's golden feathers were highly prized for their magical properties, and its flesh was considered a delicacy among the wealthy. The hunt was not just dangerous for the players. The Snidget itself was often injured or killed in the chaos, and the marsh itself was a hazard. Players would crash into trees, sink into bogs, or collide with each other in mid-air. Gertie Kettle recorded one particularly grim entry in which she described a hunt that ended with 3 riders being carried away on stretchers, and the Snidget being crushed in the hand of the victim. It was, by any modern standard, a barbaric spectacle, but it was also thrilling. And it was this thrill, this raw, untamed excitement, that ensured the game would survive. Over the decades, the hunt for the Snidget became a regular event at Quidditch Marsh. It drew crowds from neighbouring villages, and eventually from as far away as the fledgling wizarding settlements that were beginning to dot the British countryside. The game was no longer just a local pastime. It was becoming a cultural phenomenon. Yet, for all its popularity, the early version of the game was unsustainable. The Snidget population could not withstand the constant hunting. The birds were becoming rarer, and the hunts were becoming more desperate. Something had to change, and it was here, in the evolution of the game, that the first glimmers of the sport we know today. Gertie Kettle's later diary entries, written in the decades following the first hunts, show a gradual shift. She notes the introduction of a new element. A second bird, a common and less valuable species, was sometimes released alongside the Snidget to confuse the hunters and prolong the chase. This was a crude attempt to add strategy to the chaos. More importantly, she records the first attempts to create a standardized playing area, with boundaries marked by flags or stones. The game was beginning to take shape. But the true revolution came not from the rules, but from the technology. As the centuries passed, broomstick design improved dramatically. The invention of the cushioning charm in the 12th century made long-distance flight far more comfortable, and the development of the breaking charm gave riders greater control. The crude bundles of twigs gave way to crafted brooms, with handles made from smooth, polished wood and bristles that were carefully selected and enchanted for speed and stability. The broomstick was no longer a tool of necessity. It was becoming an instrument of sport, and as the brooms improved, so did the game. The hunt for the Snidget became faster, higher, and more dangerous. The riders could now perform aerial maneuvers that would have been impossible on the older brooms. The crowds grew larger, and the stakes grew higher, but the problem of the Snidget's dwindling population remained. The bird was being hunted to the edge of extinction, and the magical community was faced with a choice: let the game die, or find a way to preserve it. The solution, when it came, was both ingenious and controversial. In the mid-13th century, a witch named Bowman Wright, a skilled metalsmith and enchantress, created the first golden snitch. It was a small, perfectly spherical ball of gold with silver wings that were enchanted to mimic the flight patterns of the Snidget. It was fast, it was elusive, and most importantly, it was indestructible. The Snidget could finally be spared. The introduction of the golden snitch transformed the game. The hunt for a living creature was replaced by the chase for a magical object. The brutality of the early hunts was gradually tempered by the introduction of rules, penalties, and positions. The game that had begun as a chaotic scramble over a marsh was slowly, over the course of centuries, becoming the Quidditch that would one day be played on the grounds of Hogwarts. But the spirit of those early hunts, that raw, untamed desire to pursue something elusive and valuable, never truly disappeared. It was encoded into the very fabric of the game. The Seeker, the player whose sole purpose is to catch the snitch, is a direct descendant of those medieval hunters who once chased a golden bird across a misty marsh. The thrill of the chase, the risk of the fall, the glory of the catch, all of it can be traced back to that damp patch of land in the 11th century, and to the diary of a witch who had the foresight to write it all down. And as the game of Quidditch was finding its form, another tradition was brewing in the halls of the great magical schools of Europe, a tradition that would test not just the skill of individual players, but the very bonds between the institutions themselves, a tradition of competition, of diplomacy, and of danger that would come to be known as the Triwizard Tournament. But that's a story for the next chapter, when we will explore the beginnings of that ancient and perilous contest. By the time the Golden Snidget was finally granted a reprieve from the brutal early games of Quidditch, the wizarding world had already begun to recognize the need for something far more structured than a chaotic chase across the moors. The 11th century had given rise to a sport that united communities in fierce, often violent, competition. But the 12th and 13th centuries demanded a different kind of gathering, not one of blood and broken bones on a broom, but one of diplomacy, of alliance, and of a fragile peace that hung by a thread across the magical nations of Europe. You see, the wizarding world of the 13th century was not the relatively stable society that Harry Potter would one day inherit. It was a patchwork of ancient feuds, territorial disputes, and simmering resentments between the great magical schools. Hogwarts, Bogsbatons, and Durmstrang were not merely centres of learning. They were power bases, each cultivating their own traditions, their own political influence, and their own fiercely loyal alumni. The potential for open conflict was ever present, a cold war of magical supremacy that could have erupted into devastation at any moment. And so, in a move that would define inter-school relations for centuries, the heads of these three institutions came together near the end of the 1300s to forge a pact. It was not a treaty signed in blood, nor a grand alliance against a common enemy. It was something far more clever, far more insidious in its genius. They created the Triwizard Tournament. This was the 13th century establishment of the tournament between Hogwarts, Bogsbatons and Durmstrang, and its purpose was as much about preventing war as it was about celebrating magical prowess. Think of it as a pressure valve for the entire wizarding continent. Instead of allowing nationalistic pride to fester into armed conflict, the tournament channeled that very pride into a controlled, spectacular competition. Champions would represent their schools, not as soldiers, but as athletes and scholars. The glory of victory would be immense, but the cost of defeat would be measured in points, not in lives lost on a battlefield. The tournament served as a diplomatic tool to prevent wizarding wars. A brilliant piece of political engineering disguised as a game. It gave the young, ambitious and powerful a stage on which to prove their worth, to earn honour for their school, and to bleed off the aggressive energy that might otherwise have been turned toward darker purposes. But the tournament was not a safe haven. It was never meant to be. The tasks were designed to be deadly, to test the very limits of magical ability and courage. The founders understood that true greatness is forged in the crucible of genuine danger, and so, the first champions faced challenges that would make a modern student weep with terror. Dragons of the deepest layers, enchanted mazes that shifted their walls with a malevolent intelligence, and underwater trials that tested not just skill, but the will to survive. And survive they did for a time. But the dark history of the high death toll that led to the tournament's eventual hiatus began to accumulate with each passing decade. The official records are sparse, deliberately so, but the whispers of those early contests speak of a gruesome reality. Champions were not merely defeated, they were lost, drowned in lakes that had been enchanted to hold them, incinerated by flames that no charm could quench, or simply vanished into the depths of a labyrinth, never to be seen again. The tournament became a spectacle of horror as much as of wonder, a macabre celebration where the price of failure was the ultimate one. By the late 18th century, the death toll had become unacceptable. The very purpose of the tournament as a diplomatic tool was being undermined by the sheer number of funerals it generated. Families of fallen champions demanded justice, and the political tensions the tournament was meant to soothe only grew sharper. The Triwizard Tournament was suspended, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded too well in its original, brutal design. It had become a symbol of the very conflict it was meant to prevent. The echoes of those early, deadly contests still linger in the halls of Hogwarts, in the ancient stones of Bookbatons, and in the cold, dark corridors of Durmstrang. The tournament was a reminder the wizarding world, for all its magic, was still a place of profound risk and consequence. And as the tournament faded into memory, another kind of conflict was brewing, one that would test the very foundations of magical law and the relationship between wizards and the other sentient beings who shared their world. The fires of the Triwizard had been banked, but the embers of rebellion were about to be fanned into a blaze that would scar the history of magic forever. That story, the story of the Goblin Rebellions, is a tale of broken promises, ancient grudges, and a war that was never truly won. The Triwizard Tournament, for all its pomp and ceremony, was a fragile piece, a spectacle designed to channel the competitive, often violent, energies of young witches and wizards into something resembling sport. But beneath the cheering crowds and the golden cups, a much older, much uglier conflict was simmering, a conflict that the wizarding world preferred to forget, but which the history of magic curriculum forces every student to confront. It was a conflict not between wizards, but between wizardkind and another intelligent, ancient, and deeply resentful race, the goblins. To understand the Goblin Rebellions, you must first understand the deep-seated resentment that fueled them. This was not a simple case of one group wanting power over another. It was a wound that had been festering for centuries, a wound born of two specific, and to the goblin mind, unforgivable grievances. The first was the matter of wand rights. In the wizarding world, A wand is the ultimate symbol of magical authority. It is the tool that separates the wizard from the mundane. But goblins, who possess their own form of powerful, wandless magic, were forbidden by wizarding law from carrying wands. This was not a mere inconvenience. It was a deliberate, institutionalized insult. It was a declaration that goblins were not, and could never be, considered equal magical beings. They were a conquered people, disarmed and humiliated, forced to rely on their own innate abilities, while wizards flaunted their wands as badges of supremacy. The second grievance was even more personal, and it cut to the very heart of goblin culture. Goblins have a unique and sacred relationship with their creations. When a goblin forges a sword or crafts a piece of silver jewelry, they believe that the object retains a part of the maker's essence. The transaction is not a simple sale. It is a lease, a temporary transfer of custody. The true ownership, in the goblin mind, always remains with the creator. But wizards, with their casual disregard for goblin tradition, treated these objects as simple property. They bought goblin-made armor and silver, and, when the original owner died, they passed it on to their children. They saw no need to return the items to the goblin forge. This theft of ancestral creations, this violation of their most sacred customs, was a constant, burning ember of rage. The goblins were not just being denied wands, they were being robbed of their very history, one silver goblet at a time. This resentment did not remain silent. It erupted again and again into open warfare. The most infamous of these conflicts were the Goblin Rebellions of the 17th and 18th centuries. These were not small skirmishes. They were bloody, brutal campaigns that scarred the British magical landscape. And at the heart of the most violent of these uprisings stood a figure whose name is still whispered with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. Urg the Unclean. Urg was not a king, nor a general in any traditional sense. He was a revolutionary, a firebrand who understood that the goblins could not win a war of attrition against the wizarding population. Instead, he waged a war of terror. He and his followers did not seek to hold territory. They sought to inflict maximum damage, to remind the wizarding world that the cost of their arrogance would be paid in blood. They would strike at remote villages, ambush wizarding patrols, and then vanish back into the mountains and caves they knew so well. The name the Unclean was not an insult from his own people. It was a title he earned from his enemies, a mark of his willingness to use any tactic, no matter how savage, to achieve his goal. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, and for a time he made the wizarding authorities look helpless. The rebellions were a chaotic, bloody mess. There were sieges of goblin strongholds, desperate last stands, and brutal reprisals on both sides. Wizarding histories tend to gloss over the details, presenting the rebellions as a series of unfortunate but necessary conflicts to maintain order. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. The rebellions were a direct result of wizarding policy. They were the inevitable consequence of a society that refused to see goblins as anything more than a useful but inferior species. The battles were not fought over land or resources. They were fought over dignity, over the right to be recognized as a sovereign magical people. So why does the history of magic curriculum focus so heavily on these specific conflicts? The answer is not as simple as teaching students about the past. The curriculum, as taught by Professor Binns, presents the rebellions as a series of dates and names, a dry recitation of battles lost and won. But the subtext, the real lesson, is one of control. By forcing every young witch and wizard to memorize the details of the Goblin Rebellions, the Ministry of Magic is reinforcing a specific narrative. It is a narrative that says, this is what happens when we do not maintain order. This is what happens when other magical beings forget their place. The curriculum is a tool of cultural memory, a way of ensuring that the fear of another rebellion remains alive in the collective wizarding consciousness. It is a warning, wrapped in the guise of education. The rebellions eventually faded, not because the grievances were resolved, but because the wizarding world became more organized, more powerful, and more ruthless. In its enforcement of the Statute of Secrecy, the goblins were pushed to the margins, forced into a grudging coexistence, but the resentment never died. It simply went underground, festering in the dark, waiting for another spark. The wounds of the 17th and 18th centuries are still raw, and they continue to shape the relationship between wizards and goblins to this very day. The peace, such as it is a fragile one, built on a foundation of blood and stolen silver, and as the wizarding world tried to rebuild and move forward, it turned its attention to other matters. It began to look inward to the very heart of its own society. The next chapter in this hidden history takes us to a place that became a symbol of both magical community and the growing tensions that would define the centuries to come. A place where the lines between wizard and creature, between safe haven and dangerous frontier, were drawn in the snow. The story of that village, and the laws that were born from its violence, is the story of the Rise of Hogsmeade. The deep-seated resentment of the goblin race toward wizarding authority did not vanish with the blood-soaked fields of the 17th and 18th centuries. In fact, one of the most pivotal flashpoints in that long history of rebellion came not in some distant mountain fortress or hidden cavern, but in a place that would later become synonymous with cozy inns, butterbeer, and the simple pleasures of wizarding life. That place is Hogsmeade, the only all-wizarding village in Britain, and its story begins long before the skirmishes, in the aftermath of Hogwarts' founding, when a man named Hengist of Woodcroft made a decision that would echo through centuries. Hengist was a wizard who had seen enough of the Muggle world. After the Norman conquest, when Muggle lords and petty kings carved up the land with iron and fire, he sought a refuge where magic could be practiced openly, without fear of persecution or the prying eyes of non-magical folk. He chose a valley in the Scottish Highlands, not far from the newly built Hogwarts School, and there he founded a settlement. It was a bold act, because at that time, witches and wizards still mingled freely with muggles, but the seeds of separation were being sown. Hengist's vision was simple: a village where magical families could live, trade, and raise their children without the constant need to conceal their abilities. He named it Hogsmeade, and it became the first, and for many centuries the only, fully wizarding community in Britain. The village grew slowly at first. A handful of cottages, a small inn, a few shops, but its location was strategic. It sat at the foot of the mountains, near the Black Lake, and most importantly, within sight of Hogwarts Castle. The founders of the school had already chosen this remote region for its isolation, and now a village had sprouted beside it, creating a natural symbiosis. Students and professors could visit for supplies, for leisure, for news from the outside world. The two communities became inseparable, but that closeness also made Hogsmeade a target. When the Goblin Rebellions flared, the village found itself thrust into the centre of conflict. The most significant of these uprisings, at least from the perspective of the village's history, was the Rebellion of 1612. That year, Goblin forces, armed with their own fierce magic and centuries of accumulated grievance, swept through the Highlands. They knew that Hogwarts was a seat of wizarding power, and they knew that Hogsmeade was its lifeline, so they came. The Battle of Hogsmeade in 1612 was not a grand open-field confrontation. It was a brutal street-by-street struggle, fought among the cobblestones and timber-framed buildings. Witches and wizards barricaded themselves inside the Three Broomsticks and the Hogshead Inn, while goblin raiders tried to burn them out. The village became a hub for the rebellion, but not in the way the goblins had hoped. It became a rallying point for wizarding resistance. From Hogsmeade, messages were smuggled to Hogwarts, and from Hogwarts, reinforcements were sent through hidden ways. And those hidden ways are perhaps the most enduring legacy of that turbulent time. The founders of Hogwarts, wise to the dangers of the world, had foreseen that the school might one day need to be defended or evacuated, so they commissioned a network of secret tunnels linking the castle to the village of Hogsmeade. These passages were not for midnight snack runs, or for students sneaking into the Shrieking Shack. They were military precautions, designed to allow teachers and trusted allies to move between the school and the outside world unseen, even if the castle was under siege. During the Rebellion of 1612, those tunnels proved invaluable. Healers moved wounded villagers up to the hospital wing. Supplies of potions and food flowed downward. And when the goblins finally breached the outer defences of the village, a coordinated retreat through the passages saved countless lives. The tunnels connected Hogsmeade's cellar to the castle's dungeons, a quiet artery of survival beneath the frozen ground. After the rebellion was suppressed, at least temporarily, the village rebuilt. The scars faded, but the tunnels remained, a silent reminder that even the most peaceful hamlet could become a fortress. Hogsmeade continued to thrive, its shops and taverns welcoming generations of Hogwarts students. It never lost its character as a haven for magical folk, a place where the old ways persisted without apology. But the world was changing. The Statute of Secrecy loomed on the horizon, a cataclysm that would transform everything. How would a village that had lived openly for centuries adapt to a world where magic had to be hidden? That question would soon demand an answer, and the answer would reshape the very fabric of wizarding society. The previous chapter ended in Hogsmeade, the only all-wizarding village in Britain. A sanctuary carved out by Hengist of Woodcroft in the wake of the 1612 Goblin Rebellion. That rebellion was a bloody affair, fought in the streets of that very village. And it served as a stark warning to the wizarding world. The Muggles were growing in number, in organisation, and in suspicion. The days when a wizard could fly his broom over a village green without a second thought were numbered. The world was changing, and it was about to change forever. By the late 17th century, the tension between the magical and non-magical worlds had reached a breaking point. For centuries, witches and wizards had lived openly, albeit cautiously, among Muggles. But the witch hunts were not just a Muggle phenomenon. They were a symptom of a deeper fear. A fear that magic itself was a threat to the established order. The burnings, the drownings, the trials by ordeal. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were a systematic attempt to eradicate something that the Muggles could not understand and could not control, and the wizarding world, for all its power, was losing. It was in this atmosphere of fear and persecution that the International Confederation of Wizards convened in 1689. Delegates from magical communities across Europe, and indeed the world, gathered in secret to discuss a radical proposal. The idea was simple, yet terrifying in its scope: to voluntarily withdraw from the Muggle world entirely, to hide, to become a secret society, operating in the shadows. While the Muggles believed they had won, the debate was fierce. Some argued that hiding was cowardice, that wizards had a duty to protect the innocent Muggles from dark creatures and rogue magic. Others, more pragmatic, pointed out that the Muggles were now too numerous, too organised, and too dangerous to be managed openly. The Statute, as it would come to be known, was not signed overnight. It took 3 years of negotiation, of compromise, of bitter argument, before the final document was ratified. The year was 1692. That is the turning point that changed the wizarding world forever. The International Statute of Secrecy was enacted, and with it, the entire structure of magical society was upended. Overnight, every witch and wizard was required to conceal their abilities. Broom flights were restricted to after dark and away from Muggle eyes. Magical creatures were to be hidden or, if they could not be hidden, explained away as myths and legends. The great magical beasts of the British Isles, the dragons, the hippogriffs, the thestrals, were driven to the edges of the map into reserves and sanctuaries where no Muggle would ever stumble upon them. The wizarding world went underground, literally and figuratively. But the Statute was not just a law. It was a massive logistical undertaking of erasing magic from the Muggle memory. Think about the scale of that operation. For centuries, magic had been woven into the fabric of everyday life. There were magical marketplaces in the heart of London, potion ingredients sold alongside vegetables, and enchanted objects in every other home. All of that had to be hidden, sealed away, or destroyed. The Ministry of Magic, which would not be formally established for another century, had to create an entire department dedicated to the enforcement of secrecy. This was the precursor to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. But its earliest form was something far more clandestine. There was, for instance, the hidden Department of Intoxicating Substances. This was not a department about regulating fire whiskey or butterbeer. No, its purpose was far more sinister and far more necessary. It was tasked with the systematic erasure of magical knowledge from the Muggle world. When a Muggle saw a dragon, the department would dispatch a team of obliviators to modify their memory. When a cauldron was left bubbling in a village square, they would concoct a plausible Muggle explanation. A brewing competition perhaps, or a new method for making soup. When a witch or wizard was caught performing magic in front of a Muggle, the department would step in to ensure that the witness was left nothing but a vague sense of confusion. A story they would eventually dismiss as a dream. The work was relentless. Every magical family had to be registered. Every magical dwelling had to be made unplottable. Every magical creature had to be catalogued and its habitat concealed. The wizarding world became a hidden world, a mirror image of the Muggle world, existing in the same spaces but never touching. The great wizarding institutions, Gringotts, Mungos, the ministry itself, were built in the shadows, accessible only to those who knew the secret ways. Diagon Alley was hidden behind a brick wall in a Muggle shopping street. Platform 9 3/4 was concealed between two Muggle train platforms. The entire infrastructure of magical life was rebuilt around the principle of concealment. And yet the statute was not just about hiding, it was also about control. The wizarding world had to police itself more strictly than ever before. The old Wizards' Council, which had governed for centuries, was deemed too informal, too local for the new world order. A more centralized, more bureaucratic system was needed. The seeds of the Ministry of Magic were sown in the years following 1692, as the wizarding community realized that secrecy required organization. It required laws, enforcement, and a permanent body to oversee the delicate balance between the magical and non-magical worlds. The Statute of Secrecy was a radical solution to a centuries-old problem. It was a surrender of the open life that wizards had known for millennia, but it was also a survival strategy. By hiding, the wizarding world ensured its own continuity. The witch hunts ended, not because the Muggles became more tolerant, but because they no longer had anything to hunt. The fires died down, the accusations faded, and magic became a thing of fairy tales and folklore. The wizarding world, safe in its hidden corners, could breathe again, but the cost of that safety was immense. The wizarding world became isolated, insular, and suspicious of outsiders. The old connections between magical and Muggle families were severed. Wizards who married Muggles were now breaking the law. The pure-blood ideology, which would later poison the wizarding world, was born in part from this enforced separation. The Statute of Secrecy, for all its necessity, created a divide that would take centuries to heal. And so, as the 18th century dawned, the wizarding world was a world in transition. The old ways were gone, and a new order was rising. The Ministry of Magic, the institution that would come to define modern wizarding governance, was taking shape in the shadows of the Statute. It was a government born of necessity, built on the foundations of secrecy, and destined to become the most powerful force in the magical world. The story of how that ministry was born, and the struggles that accompanied its rise, is a story for another night. For now, let us rest, knowing that the wizarding world, hidden but not forgotten, was beginning a new chapter in its long and hidden history. The next chapter, the birth of the ministry, is where we will pick up our story. The International Statute of Secrecy of 1692 had fundamentally altered the course of magical history, but it had not yet reshaped the structure of magical government. The Wizards' Council, that ancient body that had governed British magical society for centuries, found itself suddenly obsolete. It had been designed for a world where magic was open, where wizards could settle disputes with duels in public squares, where the governance of magical folk was a matter of tradition rather than bureaucracy. But the statute demanded something the council had never been built to provide: secrecy on an unprecedented scale, enforcement across every corner of the British Isles, and a centralised authority that could speak for all magical people with a single unified voice. The old council had been a loose assembly of the most powerful witches and wizards of their time, meeting in chambers that shifted and rearranged themselves and according to the whims of their occupants. There were no formal records of who had served, no clear chain of succession, no codified laws. Decisions were made by whoever could shout loudest or cast the most convincing charm. It had worked well enough for centuries because the magical population was small, scattered, and largely self-governing, but the world had changed, and the council had not changed with it. By the early years of the 18th century, it had become painfully clear that the Wizards' Council could no longer function. The statute required constant vigilance, and the council's informal methods were simply not up to the task. There were reports of muggles witnessing magic in remote villages, of broomstick flights spotted over London, of magical creatures wandering too close to muggle settlements. Each incident required a response, but there was no system for coordinating those responses, no central authority to dispatch obliviators, no standardized procedures for handling breaches. The council was drowning in a sea of paperwork it had never needed before, and so, in the year 1707, a decision was made that would change the wizarding world forever. The Wizards' Council was dissolved, and in its place, a new institution was born: the Ministry of Magic. It was not a gradual transition, not a slow evolution of existing structures. It was a deliberate, conscious break with the past, a recognition that the old ways could no longer serve the new reality. The ministry was designed from the ground up to be what the council had never been: organised, hierarchical, and capable of enforcing the Statute of Secrecy with the full weight of magical law. The man chosen to lead this new institution was Ulick Gamp. He was not the most powerful wizard of his age, nor the most brilliant, nor the most charismatic. What he possessed was something far rarer: an unshakable belief in order, a mind that craved structure, and a patience for the tedious work of building systems from nothing. Gamp had served on the Wizards' Council in its final, chaotic years, and he had seen firsthand what happened when governance was left to tradition and personality. He was determined that the ministry wouldn't repeat those mistakes. His first act as Minister for Magic was to establish the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. This was not merely a bureaucratic decision, it was a statement of intent. The ministry's primary purpose in those early years was enforcement. The Statute of Secrecy was the foundation upon which everything else would be built, and that foundation needed guardians. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement became the ministry's sword and shield, the arm that reached into every corner of magical Britain to ensure compliance with the new order. But enforcement was only the beginning. Gamp understood that the ministry could not simply police the magical population. It had to serve them as well. He began the slow, painstaking work of building a government from scratch. There were departments to create, positions to fill, procedures to establish. Every aspect of magical life that had once been handled by local custom or informal agreement now needed a formal structure. The ministry grew rapidly, absorbing functions that had never before been centralized: magical transportation, magical education, magical creature regulation, magical trade, and with centralization came power. The ministry, unlike the council, had the authority to make laws that applied to every witch and wizard in Britain. It could tax, it could regulate, it could punish, and it could define who was and was not entitled to the protections of magical law. This last point would prove to be the most controversial legacy of the Ministry's founding. The Wizards' Council had been, for all its flaws, a body that represented the magical community in its broadest sense. Wizards, witches, goblins, house elves, centaurs, merpeople and other magical beings had all had some voice, however limited, in the affairs of the magical world. The council had been a gathering of the magical peoples, not merely a government of wizards. But the ministry was different. It was a human institution, designed by wizards for wizards, and its laws reflected that bias from the very beginning. One of the first major pieces of legislation passed under Ulick Gamp's leadership was a series of laws that systematically stripped non-human magical beings of their rights. Goblins, who had long held a tense but recognized place in magical society, found themselves excluded from positions of authority within the ministry. House elves, who had served wizarding families for centuries, were legally classified as property rather than persons. Centaurs and merpeople, who had always maintained their own separate societies, were pushed to the margins of magical law, their territories increasingly encroached upon by wizarding expansion. The justification for these measures was always the same. The Statute of Secrecy required it. Non-human magical beings, the argument went, could not be trusted to maintain the secrecy that was now the foundation of magical existence. They had their own agendas, their own loyalties, their own ways of doing things that did not always align with the needs of the wizarding world. Better, the ministry argued, to centralize authority in human hands, to ensure that the enforcement of the statute was consistent and reliable. But the real reason was simpler and uglier. The ministry was a human institution, and humans, even magical ones, have always been prone to believing in their own superiority. The transition from the Wizards' Council to the ministry was not just a change in governance. It was a shift in philosophy. The old council had seen itself as a steward of the magical world, a caretaker for all magical beings. The ministry saw itself as a ruler, and it saw non-human magical beings as subjects to be managed, rather than partners to be respected. The effects of this shift were immediate and lasting. The Goblin Rebellions, which had simmered for centuries, intensified as goblins saw their status in magical society erode. The Centaurs withdrew further into their forests, refusing all contact with the ministry. The merpeople became more secretive, more hostile to human intrusion, and the house elves, who had once been free servants, gradually became the enslaved beings that Harry Potter would encounter centuries later. Ulick Gamp served as Minister for Magic for 18 years, from 1707 to 1725. By the time he stepped down, the ministry was firmly established as the governing body of magical Britain. It had departments, regulations, a system of courts, and a network of enforcement officers that reached into every village and hamlet. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary achievement of organisation and will, but it was also an institution built on exclusion. The ministry had centralised power, yes, but it had done so by deciding who would and would not share in that power. The Wizards' Council had been imperfect, but it had been inclusive in a way that the ministry never would be. The transition from one to the other was not simply a story of progress and efficiency. It was also a story of loss, of rights revoked, of voices silenced. And yet the ministry endured. It weathered rebellions, scandals, and wars. It adapted to changing times and changing threats. It became the institution that Harry Potter would one day confront, a vast bureaucracy that was both necessary and deeply flawed. But in 1707, it was still new, still hopeful, still full of the promise of a better ordered world. The birth of the ministry marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The old magical world, with its informal councils and its traditions, stretching back to the dawn of wizardkind, had given way to something more modern, more structured, and far less forgiving. The Statute of Secrecy had demanded a new kind of government, and the ministry was the answer. But the ministry was not the only institution being born in those years. Across the Channel, in France, a different kind of transformation was taking place. An alchemist named Nicolas Flamel was unlocking secrets that had eluded wizards for centuries, secrets that would lead him to the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. And that story, the story of alchemy and the Flamel connection, is the subject of our next chapter. The Ministry of Magic had barely settled into its new chambers when an older, stranger magic began to stir in the shadows of Europe. While Ulrich Gamp was busy building departments and signing decrees, a French scribe and bookseller was quietly unlocking the most coveted secret in the history of alchemy. His name was Nicolas Flamel, and his work would bridge the gap between the ancient mysticism of the past and the modern potion making that would one day be taught in Hogwarts dungeons. To understand what Flamel achieved, you must first understand what alchemy truly was. It was not simply the attempt to turn lead into gold, though that was certainly part of its reputation. Alchemy was the great-grandfather of chemistry, a mystical science that sought to understand the very fabric of transformation. Its practitioners believed that all matter was alive, that metals grew in the earth like plants, and that with the right processes, you could perfect any substance. The ultimate goal was the Philosopher's Stone, a legendary substance that could transmute any metal into pure gold and produce the elixir of life, granting immortality to its possessor. For centuries, alchemists had chased this dream through smoke-filled laboratories and cryptic manuscripts. They wrote in riddles and symbols, partly to protect their secrets, and partly because they themselves did not fully understand what they were doing. The Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, the works of Jabir ibn Hayyan, the strange experiments of Roger Bacon, all of these were steps along a path that seemed to lead nowhere. Then came the 14th century, and with it, Nicolas Flamel. Flamel was not born into wealth or magical power. He was a scribe and a bookseller, living in Paris on the Rue de Montmorency. His shop was modest, his life unremarkable. But in the year 1357, Flamel had a dream that would change everything. In that dream, an angel appeared to him, holding a magnificent book bound in beaten copper. The angel spoke, though Flamel could never quite remember the words. What he did remember was the book itself, filled with strange symbols and alchemical diagrams that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. When he woke, Flamel was consumed with the desire to find that book. He searched Paris, then all of France, and finally a stranger brought him exactly what he sought. The book was titled, and it was unlike anything Flamel had ever seen. It contained 7 leaves, each covered in intricate illustrations. There were serpents swallowing their own tails, fountains of youth, and a strange tree with roots of fire. The text was written in a language Flamel could not read, a mixture of Hebrew, Greek, and something older. For 21 years, Flamel studied that book. He travelled to Spain, seeking scholars who could help him decode its mysteries. He met a learned Jew named Master Canches, who recognised the symbols and began to translate. But Canches fell ill on the journey back to Paris and died, leaving Flamel with only fragments of understanding. Yet those fragments were enough. In the year 1382, on the 17th of January, Nicolas Flamel succeeded where countless others had failed. He created the Philosopher's Stone. The accounts of that moment are scarce, but what we know is extraordinary. Flamel recorded that he transmuted half a pound of lead into pure gold, using only a small amount of the red powder that was the stone's physical form. He did not stop there. He and his wife, Perenelle, began to produce the elixir of life, drinking it regularly. They did not age. They did not die. For the next 600 years, Nicolas Flamel walked the earth as a living legend, the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone in recorded history. Now, here is where the story connects to the wizarding world you know. Flamel was not just an alchemist, he was a wizard. His work bridged the gap between ancient mysticism and modern potion making in a way that no one else had managed. Before Flamel, potion making was a chaotic art, reliant on intuition, lunar cycles, and a great deal of luck. A potion might work once and fail 100 times, with no one understanding why. Flamel's systematic approach, his insistence on precise measurements and controlled conditions, laid the groundwork for the exacting science that would later define Hogwarts potions classes. But Flamel's influence did not stop at theory. He entered into a secret correspondence with the early headmasters of Hogwarts, a correspondence that would shape the school's approach to alchemy for centuries. The first letters were exchanged in the late 14th century. Shortly after the school's founding, the headmasters of that era were struggling to integrate alchemical principles into their curriculum. They had the ancient texts, the symbols, the theories, but they lacked practical knowledge. Flamel provided that knowledge. In his letters, Flamel described the preparation of the stone in careful detail, though he always withheld the final, crucial ingredient. He wrote about the 3 stages of the great work: the nigredo, the blackening, the albedo, the whitening, and the rubedo, the reddening. He explained how the prima materia, the base substance of all things, could be purified and perfected through these stages. He sent diagrams and formulas, all written in the same cryptic style as his famous book. The headmasters of Hogwarts treasured these letters. They kept them in a locked chest in the headmaster's office, adding to them over the years. Each new headmaster would write to Flamel, asking questions, seeking guidance. Flamel always answered, though his replies grew shorter as the centuries passed. He had seen so much, lived so long, that he had become a repository of magical knowledge unlike any other. It was this correspondence that eventually led to the creation of the Hogwarts alchemy curriculum. The early professors, guided by Flamel's wisdom, developed a course that taught students the principles of transmutation, the properties of magical metals, and the theory behind the elixir of life. They did not teach students how to create the Philosopher's Stone. That secret remained with Flamel alone, but they taught them to understand it, and in doing so, they ensured that the ancient art of alchemy would not be lost. Flamel's connection to Hogwarts deepened over time. He became a friend to the school, a silent benefactor. When the Chamber of Secrets was first opened, it was Flamel who advised the headmaster on how to contain the basilisk. When the Goblin Rebellions threatened the wizarding world, Flamel provided gold to fund the defense. He was always there, in the background, a shadowy figure whose influence touched every corner of magical Britain. But Flamel's greatest contribution was the Philosopher's Stone itself. For 6 centuries he guarded it, using it to sustain his own life and to produce gold for charitable works. He built hospitals, founded churches, and supported the poor. He lived quietly in Paris, then in London, then in a small village in the countryside. He watched empires rise and fall, wars begin and end, and the wizarding world transform from a scattered collection of covens into a structured secret society. By the time of the International Statute of Secrecy in 1692, Flamel was already over 300 years old. He had seen the need for secrecy long before the ministry enforced it. He knew that the Muggle world was changing, becoming more rational, more scientific, less willing to believe in magic. He supported the Statute, understanding that it was necessary for survival. And yet, for all his wisdom, Flamel knew that his time would eventually come. The Philosopher's Stone could extend life indefinitely, but it could not make it eternal. There would come a day when Flamel would have to choose between continuing to live and finally resting. That day came in the 1990s, when a young wizard named Harry Potter faced Lord Voldemort in the dungeons of Hogwarts. Flamel, then over 600 years old, agreed to destroy the stone, knowing that his own life would end with it. But that is a story for another time. For now, we must understand that Nicholas Flamel was more than just an alchemist. He was the living bridge between the ancient world of mysticism and the modern world of potion making. He took the chaotic, intuitive art of the old alchemists and transformed it into a disciplined science. He shared that knowledge with Hogwarts, ensuring that future generations of witches and wizards would have a foundation to build upon. And yet alchemy was only one thread in the vast tapestry of magical history. There were other arts, other sciences that were evolving alongside it. The study of charms, for instance, was undergoing its own transformation, moving from simple incantations to complex spell structures that could reshape reality itself. The evolution of charms and hexes would soon become a defining feature of wizarding education. And the story of how that happened is one you will want to hear. The Philosopher's Stone was a triumph, but it was a triumph of substance, of matter transformed and life extended. Yet magic has always been more than what you hold in your hand. It is what you speak, what you will, into being with a word and a flick of the wrist. The spells we know today, the ones taught in classrooms and whispered in duels, did not spring fully formed from the minds of the Hogwarts founders. They are the descendants of something far older, far wilder, and far more dangerous. To understand the charm you cast without thinking, you must first understand the ancient rite from which it was born. Consider the Patronus, that silvery guardian, a shield against the soul-eating Dementor, is one of the most advanced and mysterious spells in the modern repertoire, but its roots stretch back to a time before the Ministry, before Hogwarts, before there was even a word for magic. In the earliest days, when wizards lived in scattered tribes and faced threats, not just from muggles, but from creatures of pure psychic malice. The Patronus was not a spell you learned from a book. It was a rite of protection, a desperate act of will. Ancient texts speak of early witches and wizards who would gather in circles, not to cast a charm, but to summon a guardian from the very essence of their happiest memories. It was a raw, unrefined thing, a burst of white light that might last only a second, but it was enough to turn aside a shadow. The incantation, if it could be called that, was not the crisp Latin of Expecto Patronum. It was a chant, a prayer, a name spoken in a language that has long since faded from the earth. The spell was not standardized. It was personal, tied to the caster's blood and their deepest joy, and it could fail as often as it succeeded. For centuries, magic was like this. It was a wild art, passed from master to apprentice, from parent to child, with no two practitioners casting the same spell in the same way. A fire-making charm in one village might require a different word and a different gesture than the one used in the next valley over. This was the natural order of things, but it was also a recipe for disaster. Magical accidents were not rare, they were the norm. A poorly pronounced incantation could set a house ablaze. A misplaced emphasis could turn a simple levitation charm into a curse that shattered bones. The wizarding world was a dangerous place, not because of dark wizards, but because the very tools of daily life were unpredictable. The turning point came with the rise of the Wizards' Council, and later, the Ministry of Magic. As magical society grew more organized, the need for standardization became undeniable. The Ministry, in its early days, took on the monumental task of cataloging and codifying every known spell. Teams of curse breakers and charmsmiths were dispatched to every corner of Britain, collecting incantations from isolated communities and ancient families. They recorded the wand movements, the pronunciations, the intended effects, and then they began the work of simplification. The goal was not to weaken magic, but to make it safe. A single, clear incantation for each spell meant that a young witch or wizard could learn a charm without the risk of summoning something they did not intend. The Ministry decreed that all official spellwork would use a standardized form of Latin, a language that was already dead and therefore stable, resistant to the shifting meanings of living tongues. This was the birth of the modern spellbook, and it was a revolution. But this standardization came at a cost. In the process of making magic safe, the Ministry also made it predictable. The ancient rites, the ones that required a specific phase of the moon or a drop of the caster's own blood, were deemed too volatile for general use. They were locked away in restricted archives, their secrets guarded by the Department of Mysteries, and some spells, the most powerful and the most personal, were lost entirely. There are incantations recorded in the oldest texts that no modern wizard can replicate. The words are known, but the intent behind them, the spiritual connection to the magic itself, has been severed. There was a spell used by the Druids to call down the very light of the stars, a charm that could heal a wound by reversing the flow of time around it, a hex that could bind a person's shadow to the ground so they could not move. These are not forgotten because they were weak. They are forgotten because they required a kind of faith, a kind of raw, untamed belief that the modern wizarding world has trained out of its children. The ministry's standardization was a necessary evil. It prevented countless magical accidents and made education possible for the masses. But it also created a ceiling. The spells we learn at Hogwarts are the safe versions, the sanitized echoes of what once was. When you cast a simple shield charm, you are using a formula designed by committee, tested for safety and approved for classroom use. You are not casting the spell that an ancient warrior would have used, a spell that could turn aside a dragon's fire by speaking the dragon's true name. That power is still out there, buried in the archives, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to reach for it. And that is where the true danger lies. For every charm that was standardized and made safe, there was a hex that was deemed too dark to be taught. The ministry did not just simplify the light, it also codified the shadow. The dark arts, once a loose collection of forbidden knowledge passed in whispers, became a defined category, a set of spells that were illegal to even possess. But the law does not erase knowledge, it only drives it deeper underground. The spells that were too terrible for the textbooks did not vanish. They were hidden, preserved by families who remembered the old ways, by wizards who believed that some magic should never be tamed. The standardization of charms created the illusion of control. But the shadows have always been there, waiting for the right moment to step back into the light. And in the next chapter, we will follow that shadow, tracing the history of the dark arts from the ancient world to the modern era, and discovering what happens when the spells that were meant to be forgotten are finally remembered. The previous chapter traced how spells like Expecto Patronum evolved from ancient protective rites into the standardized incantations we know today, and how the Ministry of Magic worked to prevent magical accidents by formalizing wand movements and verbal components. But for every charm that was codified and taught, there was a shadow side, magic that refused to be tamed, that slipped through the cracks of regulation and thrived in the dark. This is the story of the dark arts in the shadows, a history that predates Hogwarts itself and runs like a black thread through the fabric of magical civilization. Long before the Ministry banned certain spells, long before the term unforgivable curse was ever written into law, there was magic that was simply called magic mosti evil. This phrase appears in some of the oldest surviving wizarding texts, scrawled in the margins of medieval grimoires and whispered in the candlelit chambers of covens that met under the cover of night. The medieval era was a time when the line between light and dark magic was not yet drawn by bureaucrats, but by the raw consequences of the magic itself. A healing charm that accidentally caused blindness was not considered dark, it was considered a mistake. But a spell designed specifically to cause suffering, to control another's will, or to tear the soul apart, that was something else entirely. The forbidden texts of that era are a study in obsession. Books like Secrets of the Darkest Art and Magic Mosti Evil were not simply collections of curses. They were philosophical treatises on the nature of power. Their authors believed that magic should not be limited by morality, that the only true law was the will of the caster. These texts were passed from hand to hand in secret, often written in blood or encoded in languages only the initiated could read. The medieval wizarding world was fractured, with no central authority to police such knowledge. If a witch or wizard wanted to learn the darkest magic, they could find a teacher in the shadows, or they could find a book And it was in this environment that the first Dark Lords emerged, long before Grindelwald or Voldemort ever drew breath. These were not the charismatic dictators of later centuries, but local tyrants, warlocks who seized power over small regions through terror and force. Their names are largely forgotten now, buried in the archives of the Wizards' Council, but their methods were the same as those who would follow. The use of the Imperious Curse to control minds, the Cruciatus Curse to break spirits, and the Killing Curse to eliminate opposition. One such figure was a wizard known only as the Black Hand, who ruled a stretch of the Scottish Highlands in the 10th century. He demanded tribute from every magical family in his territory, and those who refused were found dead, with their hands blackened and withered. Another was a sorceress called the Night Hag of the Fens, who used dark rituals to extend her life for over 2 centuries, preying on the young and the desperate. These early Dark Lords were not defeated by a single hero or a grand battle. They were eventually brought down by the collective action of the Wizards' Council, which had to evolve from a simple advisory body into a force of law enforcement. The Council realized that if dark magic was allowed to flourish unchecked, it would destroy the fragile trust that held magical communities together. So they began to define what was acceptable and what was not. This was the beginning of the shift in how dark magic was understood, not just as a set of harmful spells, but as a category of behavior that threatened the stability of wizarding society. As the centuries passed and the Ministry of Magic was born, the definition of dark magic continued to shift. In the early days of the Ministry, a spell was considered dark if it caused permanent harm or violated another's free will. But as the Ministry grew more powerful, the definition expanded. By the 18th century, certain types of blood magic were outlawed, even if they were used for healing. By the 19th century, any spell that required a sacrifice of any kind was automatically classified as dark. The line was no longer drawn by the nature of the magic itself, but by the fear it inspired in those who governed. This is why the history of the dark arts is so important to understand. It is not a simple story of good versus evil, but a complex tale of how a society defines its boundaries. The forbidden texts of the medieval era were not all written by madmen. Some were written by scholars who believed that all knowledge should be free, that magic should not be censored. The first Dark Lords were not all monsters. Some were desperate people who turned to dark magic because they had no other way to protect themselves or their families. But in the end, the shadows claimed them, as they claim all who walk too long in the dark. The medieval era gave way to the age of regulation, but the dark arts never truly disappeared. They simply went deeper into the shadows, waiting for the next generation of witches and wizards to discover them. And as we move forward in our story, we will see how the very tools of information and communication became the next battlefield for the soul of the wizarding world. The Daily Prophet would soon rise as a voice of authority, but even the most trusted sources can hide the darkest truths. That is the story waiting for us in the next chapter. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The shadows cast by the first Dark Lords were long, but they were nothing compared to the shadow that would soon fall over the entire wizarding world. The shadow of a single unified story. For centuries, magical folk had shared news through whispered conversations in taverns, through letters carried by owls, through the announcements of the Wizards' Council. There was no single voice, no daily record that everyone could agree upon. History was a patchwork of local legends and personal accounts. But in the year 1743, all of that changed. That was the year the wizarding world got its first daily newspaper, and with it, a new kind of power was born. The Daily Prophet did not emerge from nowhere. It was the culmination of a long tradition of magical pamphlets and broadsheets that had circulated for generations. There had been the Wizarding Weekly, a small publication out of Diagon Alley that mostly reported on potion prices and broomstick races. There was the Sorcerer's Scroll, a more scholarly journal that focused on theoretical magic and ancient runes. But none of these had the reach or the ambition of what was about to come. The founders of the Daily Prophet understood something that the Wizards' Council had never quite grasped. That information was the most powerful spell of all. If you could control what people read, you could control what they believed. And if you could control what they believed, you could control their actions. The first editor of the Daily Prophet was a witch named Cassandra Vablatsky. She was a seer, though not a particularly gifted one, and she had a keen sense for what would capture the public's attention. She knew that magical folk were hungry for news, hungry for stories that made sense of a world that was rapidly changing. The Statute of Secrecy had only been in place for about 50 years, and the magical community was still adjusting to its new reality. They were hiding from muggles, but they were also hiding from each other, scattered across the British Isles in small enclaves. The Daily Prophet promised to connect them, to give them a shared sense of identity. It was a promise that would prove both wonderful and dangerous. The newspaper's headquarters were established in a modest building off Diagon Alley, not far from the leaky cauldron. The printing press was enchanted to run day and night, producing thousands of copies with every turn of the crank. The ink was a special brew that never smudged, and the paper was charmed to be waterproof, fireproof, and resistant to tearing. It was said that the first edition of the Daily Prophet was delivered to every magical household in Britain free of charge as a kind of introduction. That first issue contained a report on the latest goblin negotiations, a recipe for self-stirring cauldron stew, and a feature on the proper care of garden gnomes. It was humble, but it was a beginning. Within a few years, the Daily Prophet had become an institution. It was no longer just a newspaper. It was the newspaper. Every witch and wizard in Britain read it, or at least pretended to. It was read aloud in the Three Broomsticks, debated in the Hogwarts staff room, and used as evidence in Wizengamot trials. The power of the press was immense, and the Ministry of Magic was quick to recognise that. The Ministry had always struggled to maintain order, especially after the chaos of the Statute of Secrecy. But now they had a tool that could shape public opinion with every headline. They did not have to force people to obey. They simply had to tell them what to think. The relationship between the Ministry and the Daily Prophet was complex from the start. On one hand, the newspaper was independent, owned by a private company that answered to its shareholders. On the other hand, the Ministry had the power to grant or deny access to official information. If the Prophet wanted to report on a Ministry investigation, they needed Ministry cooperation, and the Ministry in turn needed the Prophet to present its actions in a favourable light. It was a dance of mutual dependence, and it created a system where the truth was often bent, stretched, or simply ignored. The most famous example of this manipulation came during the Goblin Rebellions of the 18th century. The Daily Prophet reported on the conflicts with a clear bias, portraying the goblins as violent, greedy, and untrustworthy. The articles were filled with inflammatory language, describing goblin attacks as savage and barbaric. The wizarding public, reading these accounts, became more fearful and more willing to support harsh measures against the goblin population. The Ministry passed laws that restricted goblin rights, and the Daily Prophet celebrated these laws as necessary for public safety. It was a perfect example of how the press could shape not just public opinion, but public policy. But the Daily Prophet was not just a tool of the Ministry. It also had its own agenda, its own editors and writers who had their own biases and ambitions. There were journalists who genuinely believed in the power of the truth, who risked their careers to expose corruption and injustice. There were others who were more interested in sensationalism, who knew that scandal sold more copies than sober reporting. The newspaper was a living thing, full of contradictions, and it reflected the wizarding world it served, A world that was often noble, often petty, and always complicated. The role of propaganda in the Ministry's control over the magical population cannot be overstated. The Daily Prophet was the primary vehicle for this propaganda, but it was not the only one. There were also public announcements, official proclamations, and even educational materials that were distributed to Hogwarts and other magical schools. The Ministry understood that control over information was control over the future. If you could shape what children learned in their history of magic lessons, you could shape the kind of adults they would become. And if you could shape what adults read in their morning newspaper, you could shape the kind of society they would build. The Daily Prophet's coverage of historical events was particularly influential. When a major event occurred, the newspaper's version of that event became the official version. It was written down, published, and distributed to thousands of readers. It was quoted in courtrooms, referenced in academic papers, and passed down from one generation to the next. Over time, the newspaper's account became the only account. Alternative perspectives were forgotten, or suppressed, or simply never recorded. The Daily Prophet did not just report history, it created it. This was never more apparent than in the coverage of the so-called Dark Lords of the medieval era. The Daily Prophet's articles about these figures were filled with dramatic language, painting them as monsters who threatened the very fabric of wizarding society. The truth was often more complex. Some of these Dark Lords were simply ambitious wizards who had been pushed to extremes by persecution. Others were misunderstood, or mentally ill, or the victims of their own dark magic. But the Daily Prophet had no interest in nuance. Nuance did not sell newspapers. Fear did. And so, the wizarding public learned to fear. They learned to see the world in black and white, to trust the Ministry and distrust anyone who questioned it. The Daily Prophet became the lens through which they viewed reality. And that lens was carefully polished by those in power. It was a system that worked remarkably well for a time, but it was also a system that was fragile, dependent on the goodwill of those who controlled it. And goodwill, as history has shown, is a fickle thing. By the end of the 18th century, the Daily Prophet had become the most powerful institution in the wizarding world, second only to the Ministry itself. It was read by everyone, from the Minister of Magic to the lowliest clerk in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. It was a source of comfort, a source of entertainment, and a source of control. The wizarding world had traded the chaos of scattered voices for the order of a single unified story. But that story was not always true, and the truth, as we shall see, has a way of making itself known, no matter how carefully it is buried. The Daily Prophet's influence extended far beyond the pages of its newspaper. It shaped the way magical folk thought about themselves, their history, and their future. It created heroes and villains, celebrated triumphs and forgot tragedies. It was a mirror that could lie. And as the wizarding world moved into the 19th century, that mirror would reflect a growing tension. A tension that would eventually erupt in ways no one could have predicted. The giants, who had long been driven to the margins of magical society, were growing restless. The Centaurs, who had always kept their distance, were watching with ancient eyes. The world was changing, and the Daily Prophet would be there to tell the story. But whose story would it tell? That is a question we will explore in the next chapter, as we turn our attention to the giants and the Centaurs. By the time the Daily Prophet began printing its first editions in the mid-18th century, the wizarding world had already made a fateful decision about how it would classify the magical creatures that shared its world. The newspaper did not create that division, but it certainly cemented it. For centuries before the Prophet ever rolled off the press, the magical community had been struggling with a question that would define its relationship with every non-human intelligence it encountered. That question was simple, and its answer would lead to centuries of bloodshed. What makes a being, and what makes a beast a beast? The classification system that the Ministry of Magic would later formalize, had its roots in the earliest days of the Wizards' Council. In those ancient times, before there was any centralized authority to speak of, the boundaries between magical humans and other magical creatures were far more fluid. Witches and wizards lived alongside centaurs in the forests, traded with goblins in the mountains, and sometimes even allied with giants in times of war. But as human magical populations grew, and as the need for organization became more pressing, the question of who counted as a person and who counted as an animal became impossible to ignore. The tragic history of the beings versus beasts classification is not a story of careful philosophical debate. It is a story of fear, of convenience, and of treaties that were broken almost as soon as they were signed. The Wizards' Council, in its earliest attempts to codify magical law, decided that a being was any creature with sufficient intelligence to understand and abide by magical law. A beast, by contrast, was any creature that could not or would not submit to the rule of wizarding governance. On the surface, this seemed reasonable, but the classification was never applied fairly. It was applied politically. Consider the giants. In the centuries before Hogwarts was founded, giants roamed freely across the British Isles and much of Northern Europe. They were not the brutish, isolated creatures that later generations would encounter. They had their own societies, their own chieftains, and their own understanding of territory and honour. They were, by any reasonable measure, beings. They could speak, they could negotiate, they could form alliances, and for a time they did. The early wizarding communities in the Highlands and the mountains often coexisted with giant clans, trading goods and occasionally intermarrying. There are records of giant-blooded witches and wizards from this period, individuals who possess both magical power and the immense physical strength of their giant ancestors. But coexistence is fragile, especially when resources are scarce. As human populations expanded, the territories that giants had claimed for themselves began to shrink. The giants, for their part, did not respond with patience. They were not a gentle people. Their culture valued strength above all else, and when they felt threatened, they responded with violence. Raids on human settlements became more common. Entire villages were crushed underfoot. The Wizards' Council, which had once treated the giants as diplomatic partners, began to see them as a threat that could not be managed through negotiation alone. The wars that drove giants into the mountains and centaurs into the forests were not single conflicts. They were a series of brutal campaigns that stretched across decades, sometimes centuries, and they reshaped the magical geography of Britain forever. The giants, for all their physical power, could not stand against the concentrated magic of the Wizards' Council. Battle after battle, they were pushed back, forced to retreat into the highest and most inhospitable peaks, where the air was thin and the ground was frozen. The Council did not pursue them into those mountains. They did not need to. The isolation was punishment enough. Cut off from trade, from communication, from any hope of reintegration, the giant clans fractured. Their numbers dwindled. Their culture, once rich and complex, became a shadow of what it had been. By the time Hogwarts was founded, the giants were already a dying people, remembered primarily as monsters in children's stories. The centaurs fared differently, but no less tragically. They were never classified as beasts in the same way that giants were, but they were never fully accepted as beings either. The centaurs had their own ancient wisdom, their own astronomy, their own healers and seers. They were, by any measure, more civilized than many human wizards, but they refused to submit to wizarding law. They refused to be governed by a council that had no understanding of their traditions, their prophecies, or their connection to the stars. And so the Wizards' Council, unable to control them, chose to marginalize them. The wars with the centaurs were not wars of extermination, they were wars of displacement. The centaurs were driven from the lowlands, from the meadows and the river valleys, where they had roamed for millennia, and forced into the deep forests. The Forbidden Forest, as it would later be called, became their sanctuary and their prison. They were allowed to live there, but only so long as they stayed out of human affairs. The treaties that were signed in the aftermath of these conflicts were supposed to guarantee their autonomy, but those treaties were broken almost as soon as the ink was dry, and this is where the story becomes deeply entwined with the founding of Hogwarts itself. The broken treaties that Hogwarts was built upon are not often discussed in the standard history of magic curriculum. Professor Binns, in his droning monotone, would never mention them, but the truth is that the land upon which Hogwarts Castle stands was not empty when the four founders arrived. It was contested. The mountains to the north still held the remnants of giant clans, bitter and resentful. The forests to the south were home to centaur herds who had already been betrayed once by wizarding promises. The founders, in their wisdom or their arrogance, chose to build their school in the very heart of this contested territory. Godric Gryffindor, in particular, was known for his willingness to confront the giants directly. There are old legends that speak of Gryffindor single-handedly driving a giant warband from the valley where Hogsmeade would later be built. Whether those legends are true or merely embellished, they reflect a deeper truth. Hogwarts was not built on a foundation of peace. It was built on a foundation of conquest. The treaties that had been made with the giants and the centaurs were broken not by the founders themselves, but by the generations of wizards who came before them. The founders inherited a world that had already decided that some creatures were beings and some were beasts, and they built their school within that framework. The centaurs, to this day, have never fully forgiven the wizarding world for what was done to them. They keep their distance from Hogwarts, watching from the tree line, reading the stars for signs of what is to come. They do not consider themselves subjects of wizarding law, and they refuse to be classified as either beings or beasts. They are something else entirely, something older and more patient. And the giants, those few that remain, have retreated so far into the mountains that they are barely more than legend. The classification system that was supposed to bring order to the magical world instead brought isolation and extinction. But the story does not end there. The decisions made in those ancient wars, the classifications imposed by the Wizards' Council, the treaties signed and broken, all of it would echo down through the centuries. The Black family, for instance, would become infamous for their obsession with blood purity. But their prejudices were not born in a vacuum. They were the heirs of a world that had already decided who belonged and who did not. And as we turn our attention to the next chapter, we will see how one family's obsession with lineage and status reflected the deepest, darkest currents of wizarding history. The Black family tree is not just a genealogy. It is a map of every broken promise, every betrayal, and every secret that the wizarding world tried to bury. The tragic history of the beings versus beasts classification left deep scars across the magical world. Scars that never truly healed. The wars that drove giants into the highest mountain peaks and centaurs into the deepest forests were not just conflicts of territory or pride. They were battles over identity itself. And in the aftermath of those battles, as the dust settled and the boundaries between magical creatures became law, one thing became abundantly clear. In the wizarding world, bloodlines mattered more than almost anything else. This is where we must turn our attention to a family that understood this truth better than any other. A family whose name is whispered in the halls of the ministry and etched into the very foundations of Hogwarts. A family that claimed to be the most noble and most ancient house in all of magical Britain, the Blacks. To understand the Black family is to understand how aristocratic wizarding families maintained power through the centuries. Long before the Ministry of Magic ever existed, long before Hogwarts was even a dream in the minds of its founders, the Black family tree is not merely a genealogy. It is a map of power, a chronicle of influence, and a testament to the enduring grip of old money on the wizarding world. Let us trace the roots of this remarkable lineage back to the Middle Ages. to a time when magic was still wild and untamed, when the wizarding community was scattered and secretive, and when the very concept of a noble house was being forged in the fires of ambition and tradition. The earliest known ancestor of the Black family is a wizard named Linfrid of Stinchcombe, who lived sometime in the 12th century. Linfrid was a potioneer of considerable skill, though his methods were considered eccentric, even by the standards of his day. He is credited with inventing a number of medicinal potions that would later become staples of wizarding healing. But his true legacy was not in his cauldron work, it was in his descendants. Linfrid's son, a wizard named Hardwin, married a witch from a powerful family, and from that union the Black name began to take shape. By the 13th century, the Blacks had established themselves as a family of considerable wealth and influence. They owned vast tracts of land in the Scottish Highlands, land that was rich in magical properties and hidden from Muggle eyes. It was during this period that the family adopted their motto, toujours pur, always pure, a phrase that would come to define their entire existence. This was not merely a slogan. It was a declaration of war against anyone who dared to dilute the magical bloodline. The Black family maintained their power through a combination of strategic marriages, careful breeding, and ruthless elimination of any branch that strayed from the path of purity. They intermarried with other ancient families, the Malfoys, the Lestranges, the Crouches, and the Rosiers, creating a web of alliances that stretched across the entire wizarding world. These marriages were not love matches. They were political unions designed to consolidate wealth, influence, and magical power. But the Blacks did not simply rely on marriage to secure their position. They also understood the importance of institutions. And the most important institution in the wizarding world was Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The secret influence of old money on Hogwarts Board of Governors cannot be overstated. From the very beginning, the board was composed of representatives from the most powerful wizarding families who had the resources to shape the school's policies and the connections to ensure that children receive the best education possible. The Black family was always well represented on this board, and they used their position to advance their own interests. Consider this: the Board of Governors had the power to appoint and dismiss the headmaster. They controlled the school's budget. They decided which subjects were taught and which were deemed too dangerous or too frivolous. And they had the final say on matters of discipline, including the expulsion of students. For a family like the Blacks, this was a powerful tool. They could ensure that their children were never expelled for even the most egregious offences. They could pressure the headmaster to admit students from allied families, and they could block any reforms that threatened their traditional way of life. The influence of the Board of Governors extended far beyond the walls of Hogwarts. Many of the governors also held positions in the Wizards' Council, a precursor to the Ministry of Magic, and later in the Ministry itself. This meant that the same families who controlled the school also controlled the laws that governed the wizarding world. It was a closed loop of power, a system designed to perpetuate the dominance of the old money families for generation after generation. The Black family tree is a testament to this system. Look at the branches, and you will see names that appear again and again in the history of magical Britain. There is Phineas Nigellus Black, who served as headmaster of Hogwarts in the 19th century, a man whose portrait still hangs in the headmaster's office, offering advice that is often as cold and calculating as the man himself. There is Orion Black, who served on the Board of Governors and who ensured that his son, Sirius, would be raised in the pure blood tradition. And there is Walburga Black, whose portrait screams at anyone who dares to question the family's purity. But the Black family tree is also a story of rebellion. For every Phineas Nigellus or Walburga, there is a Sirius Black, a man who rejected everything his family stood for and chose to align himself with the very people his ancestors despised. Or Andromeda Tonks, who married a Muggle-born and was disowned for her transgression. These rebels are the cracks in the facade of pure blood supremacy. The evidence that even the most carefully constructed system of power can be broken. Yet for all their rebellions, the Black family remained a force to be reckoned with. Their wealth, their influence, and their connections ensured that they would never truly disappear. Even after the fall of Voldemort, even after the deaths of so many of their members, the Black name still carried weight. The family vault at Gringotts was still full of gold. The family tapestry still hung in the drawing room at number 12, Grimmauld Place, and the family legacy still shaped the wizarding world in ways both visible and invisible. The story of the Black family is the story of how aristocratic wizarding families maintained power through the centuries. It is a story of marriage and murder, of alliances and betrayals, of wealth and poverty. But above all, it is a story of blood. The blood that runs through the veins of every Black. The blood that they believed made them superior. The blood that they were willing to kill to protect. And as we close this chapter on the most noble and most ancient house of Black, we must look ahead to the next chapter in our journey through the hidden history of magic. For if the Blacks controlled the institutions of power, there was another force that controlled the very movement of wizards themselves, a force that allowed the old money families to travel across continents, to conduct their business in secret, and to maintain their influence over a world that was growing ever larger and more complex. That force is the subject of our next chapter, the history of magical transportation. The previous chapter traced the Black family tree back through the centuries, showing how aristocratic wizarding families maintained their power through bloodlines, marriage, and carefully guarded secrets. But power in the magical world has never been solely about who you are related to. It has always been about movement, about the ability to go where you need to go, when you need to go there, and to do so without being seen by the Muggles, who were increasingly populating the world around you. The history of magical transportation is not just a story of convenience. It is a story of survival, of adaptation, and of a society learning to hide itself in plain sight. Long before the Ministry of Magic regulated every flicker of magical travel, the earliest witches and wizards moved through the world by methods that were as dangerous as they were effective. The first portkeys were not the carefully enchanted objects in later centuries, designed to activate at a precise moment and carry a traveller to a specific destination. In the beginning, portkeys were unpredictable. A witch might charm an old boot or a broken teapot, only to find herself deposited on a mountaintop in a different country. Or worse, suspended in midair above a river. The enchantments were crude, the calculations imprecise, and the accidents were frequent enough that many early magical communities simply refused to use them. Those who did were often the desperate, the reckless, or the truly adventurous, and their stories were told around hearth fires as warnings to the young. It was not until the 13th century that a major breakthrough changed the face of magical travel forever. The invention of flue powder is credited to a witch named Ignatia Wildsmith, though the exact circumstances of her discovery remain shrouded in mystery. What is known is that she perfected a formula that allowed a wizard to step into any fireplace connected to the flow network and emerge from another, sometimes hundreds of miles away, in a matter of seconds. The impact was immediate and profound. For the first time, magical transportation was safe, reliable, and accessible to nearly everyone. The flow network grew rapidly, connecting homes, inns, and public buildings across Britain. It became the backbone of wizarding travel for centuries, and it remains in use to this day, a testament to Wildsmith's genius. But the flow network was not without its limitations. It required a connection to the network, which meant that isolated cottages and remote locations were often left out, and it was, by its very nature, tied to fireplaces, which meant that travellers were always arriving in someone's home or a public establishment. There was no privacy, no discretion, and no way to travel to a place that did not have a hearth. For those who needed to move unseen, or who needed to reach places where no fireplace existed, there was only one option, and it was the most dangerous of them all: apparition. The art of vanishing from one place and reappearing in another is as old as magic itself. But in the earliest days, it was not taught, it was not licensed. It was simply something that some witches and wizards could do, and others could not. Those who possessed the talent were often feared and respected in equal measure. For apparition was a skill that required immense concentration and a deep understanding of one's own magical core. A moment of distraction could result in splinching, a horrifying condition in which a traveller leaves part of their body behind. There are old records of witches arriving at their destinations missing fingers, toes, or even entire limbs, and some never arrived at all, lost forever in the void between places. For centuries, apparition remained an unregulated art, practiced by those brave or foolish enough to attempt it. It was only when the Ministry of Magic was established that the decision was made to bring it under control. The reasoning was simple: too many accidents, too many deaths, and too many muggles witnessing the sudden appearance or disappearance of a person in broad daylight. The Ministry introduced the apparition test, a rigorous examination that required candidates to demonstrate their ability to apparate safely and precisely. Those who passed were granted a license. Those who failed were forbidden from attempting it again until they had undergone further training, and those who attempted to apparate without a license faced severe penalties, including fines and, in extreme cases, imprisonment. The lost art of apparition, the wild and untamed version that had existed for millennia, faded into memory, but it never completely disappeared. There are still whispers in certain circles of witches and wizards who can apparate without a license, who have never taken the test, and who move through the world as their ancestors did, unseen and unrecorded. The Ministry turns a blind eye, for the most part, as long as no muggles notice and no accidents occur. As the centuries passed and the wizarding world grew more interconnected, the need for faster, more efficient transportation became urgent. The flu network was reliable, but it was also slow for long distances. Apparition was fast, but it was exhausting and dangerous for those who were not skilled. The answer, when it came, was not magical at all. It was borrowed from the Muggles. The Hogwarts Express is so iconic today that it is difficult to imagine the school without it. But when the train was first introduced in the mid-19th century, it was met with fierce resistance. Many in the wizarding community saw it as an admission of defeat, a sign that magic was no longer sufficient for the needs of their world. Why, they argued, should witches and wizards rely on a Muggle invention? Why should their children travel to school in a machine powered by steam and coal, when they could apparate or use the flow network? The debate was heated, and it divided families, friends, and even members of the Hogwarts staff. The resistance was not just about pride. There were genuine concerns about safety. Muggle trains were known to derail, to collide, and to catch fire. How could such a fragile contraption be trusted with the lives of young witches and wizards? And what about the secrecy of the magical world? A train full of children, wands hidden in their robes, owls in their luggage, would be impossible to conceal from the Muggle passengers and railway workers who would inevitably encounter them. But the Ministry, under pressure from the Hogwarts governors, pressed forward. They struck a deal with the Muggle Railway Company, enchanting the train so that it would be invisible to non-magical eyes. The platform itself was hidden, accessible only to those who knew how to find it, and the train was charmed to be safer than any Muggle locomotive, protected by spells that would prevent derailment, fire, or collision. The Hogwarts Express became a symbol of the wizarding world's ability to adapt, to take what was useful from the Muggle world and make it their own. The train was not the only Muggle invention to be adapted for magical use. Broomsticks, of course, had been around for centuries, but their design and performance improved dramatically as wizards studied Muggle aerodynamics. The invention of the steam engine inspired the development of enchanted carriages and flying ships, and the telegraph, the telephone, and eventually, the radio all found their way into magical households, disguised and enchanted to work without electricity. The history of magical transportation is in many ways the history of the wizarding world itself. It is a story of innovation and tradition, of risk and reward, of a society learning to navigate a world that was both its home and its prison. The early portkeys, dangerous and unpredictable, gave way to the safety of the flow network. The wild, unlicensed apparition of the ancients was tamed by ministry regulation, and the Hogwarts Express, once a symbol of Muggle influence, became a beloved tradition, carrying generations of students to the school that would shape their lives. But there is always more to the story. The documents, the letters, the diaries, and the official records that survive from those early days are scattered across the wizarding world, held in private collections and hidden archives. One of the most important of those collections belongs to Bathilda Bagshot, whose research into the history of magic has uncovered truths that the ministry would prefer to keep buried. Her work is the subject of our next chapter, and it promises to reveal secrets that even the most learned historians have overlooked. The invention of Floofoutadder had made travel between fireplaces almost as easy as stepping from one room to another, and the early portkeys had tied the wizarding world together in ways that seemed miraculous. Yet for all that progress, the very connectedness of magical society meant that disasters could ripple faster than ever before, and some of those disasters, like a forgotten ember glowing beneath ash, were deliberately buried. It fell to a woman of extraordinary patience and painstaking scholarship to dig them back up, the woman who literally wrote the book on history of magic. Her name was Bathilda Bagshot, and she is one of the most important historians the wizarding world has ever produced. She was born in the early 19th century, though her exact birth year has never been confirmed, and she lived to an astonishing age. She was a contemporary of Albus Dumbledore, and she spent decades gathering every fragment of the magical past she could find. Her magnum opus became the standard textbook for Hogwarts students. But the real magic of Bathilda's work lay not in the published volume. It lay in the research she refused to let the ministry suppress. One of the most striking examples of her dedication was her discovery of what became known as the Great Fire of 1800. Most wizards had never even heard of it. The official records mention nothing. But Bathilda, sifting through the personal diaries of a long-dead ministry clerk, pieced together the evidence. On a cold November night in that year, a massive fire had swept through a hidden wizarding district in the north of England. It was not a normal fire. A rogue experimental curse, meant for use in dueling, had been left unattended in a laboratory beneath a pub. The curse ignited the building's protective wards, and the resulting chain reaction consumed nearly an entire square mile of magical dwellings. Dozens of witches and wizards perished, and the ministry, fearing panic and Muggle attention, classified the entire event. They blamed the damage on a lightning strike. Bathilda's research, published decades later in an obscure historical journal, forced the truth back into the light. The Great Fire of 1800 became a cautionary tale about the dangers of reckless spellcraft. But that was only one of the forgotten wizarding disasters she unearthed. There was the outbreak of the Vanishing Sickness in 1623, when a village of magical farmers on the coast of Wales began to fade from existence, one by one, until only empty clothes remained. Bathilda found the records in a sealed chest beneath the floorboards of an old inn. She also documented the collapse of the dragon tunnels beneath the Alps, a catastrophe that killed over 100 dragon handlers and released a dozen dragons into Muggle territory. The ministry of the time had bribed the local Muggles and rewritten the event as a mining accident. Bathilda's work restored those lost voices. Yet the most sensitive discovery of her career involved the family of Albus Dumbledore, Bathilda had lived in Godric's Hollow for many years, and she had known the Dumbledore family personally. She had known Kendra, Albus's mother, and she had seen the tragedy that unfolded when Ariana, the youngest child, was attacked by Muggle boys and left irreparably damaged. In her later years, Bathilda began to compile a more complete account of the early years of the Dumbledore family. She interviewed neighbours, gathered letters, and pieced together the sequence of events that led to Kendra's death, Aberforth's trial, and the shadow that followed Albus for the rest of his life. Her unpublished notes formed the foundation for the biography that Rita Skeeter would later write, but Bathilda herself never released them. She understood that some truths, once uncovered, need to be handled with care. Her research into the Dumbledore family revealed the quiet desperation of a brilliant young man forced to put ambition aside to care for a sister he could not heal. It showed how the death of Kendra fractured the family and how the struggle between Albus and Aberforth over Ariana's future set them against each other, and it hinted at the role Gellert Grindelwald played in that summer of broken dreams. Bathilda had kept her own counsel, but her work ensured that the full story could not be hidden forever. So when you hold a copy of In your hands, or when you hear Professor Binns drone on about the Goblin Rebellions, remember that the book itself was written by a woman who was not afraid to light a candle in the darkness of the past. She uncovered fires, plagues, and collapses that others wanted forgotten, and she laid the groundwork for understanding the most famous wizard of the modern age. But the secrets of the wizarding world are not all recorded on parchment. Some live on in the very stones of Hogwarts, in the whispers of those who never truly left. In the next chapter, we will meet the ghosts, not the transparent figures gliding through corridors, but the souls who chose to remain, bound to the castle by unfinished business or deep devotion. The ghostly residents who watch over every generation of students. Their true stories are even stranger than the ones told in the common rooms. Bathilda Bagshot spent decades digging through the ashes of forgotten wizarding history, but even she could not fully capture the stories that walk the very halls of Hogwarts itself. The ghosts who drift through the stone corridors are not merely echoes of the dead. They are living witnesses to the brutal and tragic centuries that shaped the magical world before the school became the safe haven we know. And among them, none carry heavier burdens than the house ghosts, the spectral patrons of Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, and Ravenclaw. The Bloody Baron is perhaps the most feared spirit in all of Hogwarts. He clanks through the dungeons in rusted chains, his silver-white skin permanently stained with the dark red that gives him his name. Students whisper that he is dangerous, that he has a temper even in death, and that he is the only ghost the Grey Lady will speak to with any measure of respect. But the story of how he became the Bloody Baron is not a tale of simple violence. It is a story of love, obsession, and a murder that shattered two lives before they ever truly began. In life, the Bloody Baron was a wizard of considerable power and influence. He served as a warrior in the early medieval magical conflicts that raged across Britain, a time when wizards still fought openly with swords and spells, when the line between dueling and butchery was thin. He was known for his ruthlessness, his loyalty to the old ways, and his unshakable belief that magical blood should remain pure. But his heart belonged to one person alone, the daughter of Rowena Ravenclaw herself. The Grey Lady, known in life as Helena Ravenclaw, was everything the Baron was not. She was brilliant, proud, and deeply resentful of her mother's fame. Rowena Ravenclaw was celebrated across the magical world for her wisdom, intellect, and her role in founding the greatest school of witchcraft and wizardry. But Helena felt overshadowed, reduced to a footnote in her mother's legend. She craved something that was entirely her own, something that would prove she was more than just the daughter of a founder, and so she committed the ultimate betrayal. She stole her mother's diadem, the enchanted circlet that was said to enhance the wisdom of whoever wore it. Helena fled from Hogwarts, carrying the diadem into the forests of Albania, where she hid it in a hollow tree. She believed that by taking the diadem, she would finally possess a piece of her mother's power, a piece that could never be taken back. Rowena Ravenclaw was devastated, not by the loss of the diadem itself, but by the loss of her daughter. She grew ill, her health failing, as she mourned the child who had turned against her. In her final days, she sent the Bloody Baron to find Helena and bring her home. She did not ask for the diadem. She only wanted her daughter to return before she died. The Baron, driven by his own desperate love for Helena, tracked her to the Albanian forest. When he found her, she refused to come back. She was defiant, proud, and unwilling to forgive her mother for the shadow she had cast over her entire life. The Baron pleaded, then argued, then lost control entirely. In a fit of rage and heartbreak, he killed her. The moment the spell left his wand, he realized what he had done. He had destroyed the woman he loved. He had failed the founder who trusted him, and he had condemned himself to a punishment far worse than any wizard court could devise. He took his own life on the spot, driving his blade into his own chest. But death was not the end. It was only the beginning of an eternity of guilt. The Bloody Baron now wanders Hogwarts as a reminder of the violence that medieval magical life could produce. His chains are not decorative. They are the physical manifestation of his remorse, forged from the weight of his actions. He clanks through the dungeons not to frighten students, but because he cannot bear to be anywhere else. The Grey Lady, meanwhile, drifts through the castle with an air of cold detachment, still unable to fully forgive her mother, still unable to forgive herself for the theft that set everything in motion, and she still refuses to tell anyone where the diadem is hidden, a secret she carried into death and will carry forever. But the Bloody Baron and the Grey Lady are not the only ghosts whose deaths reflect the harshness of medieval magical life. The Fat Friar, the gentle spirit of Hufflepuff House, has a story that is less known but equally tragic. In life, the Fat Friar was a wizard who chose a path of peace. He was a member of a small religious order that blended Christian faith with magical practice, a common enough arrangement in the early medieval period, and the church had not yet fully turned against witchcraft. He was known for his generosity, his love of food and drink, and his willingness to help anyone who came to him in need. He performed miracles, or what Muggles called miracles, healing the sick and blessing the crops of local farmers, but his kindness made him enemies. In the 12th century, as the church grew more powerful and more suspicious of magic, the friar was accused of heresy. His fellow clergymen saw his healing spells as demonic trickery. His blessings were called curses, and his cheerful demeanor was interpreted as a sign of a corrupt soul. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. The execution was brutal. He was burned at the stake, a common fate for witches and wizards in that era. Though the magical community would later learn to avoid such public spectacles, the friar died in agony, but he did not die with hatred in his heart. He died forgiving his accusers, praying for their souls, even as the flames consumed his own. That is why, as a ghost, he remains so cheerful. He carries no bitterness. He has no chains to drag. He simply continues to be the kind, jovial soul he always was, offering comfort to Hufflepuff students who feel lost or lonely. But his death is a stark reminder of how dangerous the medieval magical world could be. Before the Statute of Secrecy, before the Ministry of Magic, wizards and witches lived in constant fear of exposure. The friar's fate was not unique. Countless magical people were hunted, tortured, and killed by Muggles who saw their abilities as a threat. And even within the magical community itself, violence was common. Duels were fought to the death. Blood feuds lasted for generations. And the founders of Hogwarts themselves were not immune to the conflicts that tore families apart. The Grey Lady's theft of the diadem is the ultimate symbol of that tragic era. It was not a crime of greed. It was a crime of desperation, the daughter's desperate attempt to carve out her own identity in the shadow of a mother who was too brilliant to compete with. And it ended in murder, suicide, and an eternal haunting that still plays out in the corridors of Hogwarts every single night. When you see the Bloody Baron gliding through the dungeons, remember that he is not just a ghost. He is a monument to the destructive power of love and jealousy. When you see the Grey Lady drifting past the Ravenclaw common room, remember that she is still searching for something she lost centuries ago. And when you see the Fat Friar laughing with Hufflepuff students, remember that he earned his peace through suffering that would have broken a lesser soul. These are the stories that Bathilda Bagshot could only hint at in her textbooks. These are the histories that Professor Binns recites in his monotone voice, stripped of all emotion, reduced to dates and names. But the truth is far more vivid. The ghosts of Hogwarts are not just decorations. They are the living memory of a time when magic was wild, dangerous, and deeply personal. They are the scars of a medieval world that shaped everything that came after. And as the centuries passed, that world would continue to change. The rise of new technologies, new forms of governance, and new ways of thinking would transform the wizarding world in ways that even the ghosts could not have predicted. The Industrial Revolution of magic was coming, and it would bring with it inventions and conflicts that would redefine what it meant to be a witch or wizard in the modern age. The stories of the Grey Lady, the Bloody Baron, and the Fat Friar remind us that even in death, the old magical world clings to its wounds. Their centuries of silent haunting speak to a time when magic was deeply personal, often violent, and always tied to the individual witch or wizard who wielded it. But by the dawn of the 19th century, that ancient, handcrafted world was about to collide with something it had never seen before. The relentless march of industry, the Industrial Revolution that transformed Muggle Britain, did not leave the wizarding world untouched. In fact, it arrived with a peculiar and profound force, reshaping the very fabric of magical life in ways that still echo through the halls of Hogwarts today. This was not a revolution of steam and iron, but of cauldrons and broomsticks. It was the moment when magic, for the first time in its long history, became a product. Consider the humble potion. For centuries, brewing a healing draught or a luck potion was a painstaking art. A skilled potioneer would spend hours, sometimes days, sourcing ingredients from remote forests or trading with travelling herbologists. Every batch was unique, a reflection of the brewer's skill, the phase of the moon, and the quality of the moonstone. But in the early 1800s, a quiet transformation began in the back rooms of apothecaries across Britain. A wizard named Linfrid of Stinchcombe, whose name is barely a footnote in most histories, perfected a method for stabilizing potion essences using a standardized heating process. His innovation allowed potions to be brewed in large, identical batches and then bottled for later use. Suddenly, a simple pepper-up potion was no longer a luxury for the wealthy. It became a common item on every family's shelf. This was the birth of mass-produced magic. By the middle of the century, companies like the Potion Emporium in Diagon Alley were churning out thousands of vials of Skelly Grow and calming draughts each month. The convenience was undeniable. A witch or wizard no longer needed to apprentice for years to brew a basic healing potion. They could simply walk into a shop and buy one. But this convenience came at a cost. The old families, the ones who had passed down secret recipes for generations, watched with a mixture of disdain and alarm. They argued that a potion brewed with love and intention, with a personal connection to the ingredients, carried a subtle power that no factory could replicate. The tension between traditional handcrafted magic and this new modern convenience became a quiet war, fought not with spells, but with coins and prestige. The same spirit of standardization swept through the world of broomsticks. For centuries, a broom was a deeply personal object. A witch or wizard might spend years binding their own bristles, carving the handle from a specific tree, and enchanting it with a unique charm. Each broom had its own temperament, its own quirks. Some were fast but stubborn, others were steady but slow. But in the 1880s, the first commercially standardized broomsticks appeared. The Silver Arrow, the first mass-produced racing broom, offered a consistent, reliable performance. It was not as fast as a master-crafted cleanse sweep, but it was affordable and predictable. The Quidditch pitch, once a place where a player's bond with their broom was as important as their skill, began to change. Teams could now equip their entire roster with identical models, and the sport became less about the magic of the individual and more about the efficiency of the machine. This shift toward convenience and standardization reached its most profound expression in the founding of St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. Before the hospital, magical healing was a fragmented affair. Healers worked from their homes, traveling to patients or receiving them in cramped back rooms. There was no formal system, no standard of care, no centralized place for the injured to go. That changed in the early 1800s when a group of prominent healers, led by the legendary Mungo Bonham, petitioned the Wizards' Council for a dedicated institution. They argued that the increasing complexity of magical injuries, from cursed objects to experimental potions gone wrong, required a formalized approach. The result was St. Mungo's, a towering building in the heart of London, hidden from Muggle eyes, where healing became a profession, not a calling. The hospital brought order to chaos. It established standardized treatments for common curses, created a formal curriculum for healers, and published the first comprehensive guide to magical anatomy. For the first time, a young witch or wizard could train to become a healer without relying on a single mentor's knowledge. But this formalization also meant that the old ways, the folk remedies passed down through generations, the whispered cures that involved moonlit rituals and ancient incantations began to fade. The hospital was a marvel of modern magic, but it also represented the slow death of 1,000 small traditions. By the end of the 19th century, the wizarding world had changed forever. The quiet, intimate magic of the past, where every spell was a personal act and every potion a unique creation, was giving way to a world of labels, standards, and commercial catalogues. The tension was not a war, but a constant hum beneath the surface of daily life. The old families still treasured their hand-carved wands and their secret recipes, but they could not deny the convenience of a ready-made potion or a reliable broom. This was the moment when magic became an industry, and the consequences of that transformation were only beginning to unfold. As the century drew to a close, a strange calm settled over the magical world. The great conflicts of the past, the Goblin Rebellions, the witch hunts, the internal feuds of the old families seemed to have quieted. The new institutions, the ministry, the hospital, the standardized broom companies had brought a kind of peace, but it was a fragile peace, built on the assumption that progress and convenience could solve all problems. The old magic, the wild, untamed magic that once filled the forests and the mountains, was being pushed to the edges of memory. And as the world prepared for the dawn of a new century, few realized that the quiet was not a sign of resolution, but of something else entirely. The pre-war calm was settling in, and it would not last. The previous chapter explored how the 19th century transformed wizarding life through mass-produced potions and standardized broomsticks, a quiet revolution that made magic more accessible, more convenient, and far more uniform. But there is a cost to such progress. When every cauldron stirs itself and every broom flies the same, the careful craft of handwork fades into memory. And when that happens, the wizarding world begins to believe that its hardest days are behind it. That belief, as history so often proves, is the first crack in an unguarded peace. By the early 20th century, magical Britain had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The Ministry of Magic, once a fledgling body struggling to define itself, had grown into a vast, self-important bureaucracy. Its corridors were lined with departments, each one more concerned with proper forms and approved procedures than with the raw currents of power that still pulsed through the old world. The Wizengamot met in its marble hall, debating matters of broomstick regulation and cauldron thickness, while far older forces stirred in the shadows of the continent. The Ministry believed it had conquered chaos. It had not. It had only learned to ignore it. And Hogwarts, that ancient bastion of magical education, had fallen into a similar slumber. The curriculum had not changed in generations. Transfiguration, charms, potions, herbology, astronomy, all taught from the same textbooks, with the same practicals, by professors who had themselves been taught in exactly the same way. The history of magic class, delivered by the ghost of Professor Binns, was a monotonous droning of dates and names, a catalogue of the past without any sense of its living breath. There was no room in the syllabus for the old magic, the forgotten traditions, the secret knowledge that had been passed down in whispered covens long before any school existed. The founders had built Hogwarts to preserve and advance magical learning. But by the early 1920s, the school had become a museum of itself. This was the pre-war calm, a hush that felt like safety, but was really the stillness before the storm. The wizarding world had been at peace for so long that it forgot what war felt like. The last great conflict, the Goblin Rebellions of the 18th century, was taught as a dry footnote. The ancient battles with Muggles, the trials of the witch hunts, the secrecy that had reshaped magical civilization, all of it had been filed away in the archives of the Ministry, dusty and unread. The very institutions that should have been watching for danger were too comfortable to see it coming, and yet the hidden history of magic was not silent. It was waiting. In the dark corners of Nocturne Alley, in the ancestral halls of families who still remembered the old oaths, in the wand lore that Ollivanders had preserved since 382. With Common Era, there were echoes of a different world, a world where power was raw and unregulated, where magical ambition did not answer to the Ministry, where the line between light and dark was drawn not by law but by choice. That world had been suppressed, but it had never died. It had only gone underground. The calm was built on denial. The Ministry congratulated itself on its efficiency, but it had grown soft. Hogwarts produced students who could pass their O, W, L, S and N, E, W, T, S, but not students who understood the deep currents of magic. The ancient languages, the blood-bound rituals, the perilous enchantments that had shaped their ancestors. The curriculum had become a checklist, and the very idea of dangerous knowledge had been outlawed. The Department of Mysteries, buried beneath the Ministry, held secrets that few dared to study. And across the English Channel, in the heart of Europe, a young man with silver hair and a vision of wizard supremacy was beginning to gather followers. His name was Gellert Grindelwald, and he had read the hidden history that the Ministry had forgotten. He understood that the old magic was not gone. He knew the legends of the Deathly Hallows, the true story of the Elder Wand, the power that lay in the blood of ancient families. He had seen the way the ministries of the world had grown complacent, how they had traded true power for bureaucratic comfort, and he had realized that the wizarding world, for all its progress, was ripe for a reckoning. The calm before his rise was not a peace, it was a void, and nature abhors a void almost as much as magic does. So the stage was set. The hidden histories of wand lore, of the Wizards' Council, of the old covens and the forgotten wars, all of it had been buried, but not erased. And when Grindelwald raised his wand and spoke of a new order, he was not inventing something new. He was resurrecting something ancient. The wizarding world had tried to modernize itself into safety, but it had only cut itself off from its own roots. And when those roots began to stir, the calm shattered. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider what it means when a civilization forgets its past. The textbooks may grow dusty, the lessons may grow dull, and the Ministry may issue its endless regulations. But the legacy of the past does not vanish. It waits, it whispers, and eventually it demands to be heard again. And so we arrive at the final reflection, the moment where all the threads of ancient magic, forgotten councils, and centuries of tradition converge into a single undeniable truth. The wizarding world that Harry Potter entered was never a creation of the present. It was a living museum, a testament to every era that had come before it. Hogwarts itself, for all its towering spires and enchanted ceilings, was not the beginning of magic's story, but the place where that story was collected, catalogued, and preserved. Consider the very stones of the castle. They were laid by hands that had learned magic in a world without a ministry, without a statute of secrecy, without even the concept of a school. The founders themselves were products of that older world. Godric Gryffindor carried the values of a warrior society, where courage was proven in blood and steel. Salazar Slytherin brought with him the ancient traditions of blood purity and the belief that magic was a birthright, not a skill to be taught to all. Rowena Ravenclaw embodied the pursuit of knowledge that had driven the great magical scholars of antiquity. And Hel Hufflepuff represented the inclusive spirit of the scattered covens that had once welcomed any witch or wizard who sought community. Every brick, every corridor, every hidden passageway was a physical record of the conflicts and compromises that shaped magical civilization. The ancient world did not simply fade away when Hogwarts opened its doors. It remained embedded in the very fabric of the school. The Chamber of Secrets was not a later addition. It was a relic of the Founders' era, a monument to the ideological rift that nearly destroyed the school before it had even fully formed. The Forbidden Forest was not a mere boundary. It was a remnant of the wild, untamed magic that had existed long before human wizards had tried to impose order on the natural world. The ghosts who drifted through the halls were not just echoes of the dead. They were witnesses to centuries of change, their translucent forms carrying the memories of a time when magic was raw, dangerous, and unregulated. This is the legacy of the past that dictates Harry's destiny. He was not just a boy who discovered he was a wizard. He was the inheritor of 1,000 years of magical history. The prophecy that marked him was not a new creation. It was the culmination of ancient feuds, old alliances, and the unresolved tensions of the Founders' era. Voldemort himself was a product of this legacy, a dark echo of Salazar Slytherin's obsession with purity and power. The Horcruxes were not a modern invention. They were a perversion of ancient soul magic that had been practiced in secret for millennia.